The kingdom didn't fear the Duke because he killed men. They feared him because he chose not to. Duke Cedric Vaymont stood in the throne hall of Raventhorn Keep, while 3 noblemen knelt before him with swords at their throats, caught red-handed selling northern grain to enemy kingdoms during a famine that had already buried 2,000 peasants in unmarked graves. The court waited for execution. The Duke studied them like broken machinery, then walked away without a word. The noblemen lived, but their families lost everything: titles, lands, the memory of their names scraped from history like rot from wood. Power wasn't about the blade. It was about deciding who deserved to bleed and who deserved something worse than death. And in Valadorn, nobody understood that distinction better than the man who ruled from the Black Towers overlooking the Northern Sea, where storms came to die and mercy went to drown. Stay until the end. What happens when a man who controls everything meets the one thing he cannot own will shatter every rule you think you understand about power. Bukik. The winter wind cut through Raventhorn Keep like a blade looking for bone. Cedric stood at the window of his private study, watching the northern territories spread beneath him in shades of gray and white. Frozen fields, abandoned villages, roads that disappeared into blizzards before they reached anywhere worth reaching. Smoke rose from distant chimneys in thin columns that the wind tore apart before they reached the clouds. His lands, his people, his responsibility carved into his spine like scar tissue that never stopped aching. Behind him, Captain Torvin cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence. "I don't pay you to make noise," Cedric said without turning. "Your Grace, we found the smugglers. Eastern route through the mountain pass, just like you said. 12 wagons loaded with medical supplies meant for the quarantine camps." "How many men?" 17. "All dead except the merchant who organized it. He's in the dungeons waiting for your judgment." Cedric turned from the window. The study stretched around him in shadows and firelight. Walls lined with maps marked in his own handwriting. Reports stacked on every surface documenting crop failures and disease outbreaks, and the 100 small disasters that happened when winter arrived early and stayed late. He crossed to the desk where a single oil lamp burned beside a leather journal filled with names. People who owed him, people he owned, people who would die if he decided their usefulness had expired. "What's his name?" "Gregor Malth, merchant family from the capital, rich enough to buy silence, not smart enough to keep it. And the supplies? Safe in the Eastern Depot. The quarantine camps will have them by morning." Cedric picked up the journal, flipping to a marked page. Malth. The name sat in the middle of a web connecting 3 other merchant houses, 2 minor nobles, and a banking operation that funneled money out of Valadorn fast enough to fund a small war. Not just a thief. A symptom of something bigger, something infected. "Keep him alive," Cedric said. "I want him screaming in 3 days when we arrest everyone he's ever done business with. Make sure he knows exactly how many people will die because he talked." Torvin nodded, understanding flooding his expression. The Duke never punished individuals. He dismantled systems. "Anything else, Your Grace?" "The Winter Sovereign's ball. Tomorrow night. Tell me I don't have to go. You have to go. The crown expects you. Half the noble houses in the kingdom will be there." Cedric closed the journal, the leather warm under his palm. The ball. Another performance. Another room full of predators wearing silk and pretending they weren't constantly calculating how to carve pieces off each other. He'd built his reputation in rooms like that, watching men who smiled while planning betrayals, learning early that honesty was just another weapon most people were too afraid to use correctly. "I'll attend," he said. "But if one more father parades his daughter in front of me like livestock at auction, I'm burning the entire cathedral to the ground." Torvin almost smiled. "That would certainly make an impression. Get out." The captain left. Cedric remained at the desk, staring at the journal without seeing it. Tomorrow night, he would stand in that glittering hall, surrounded by people who feared him, desired him, hated him, needed him, and he would feel nothing except the weight of playing a role that had stopped fitting years ago. The ruthless Duke, the northern monster, the man who controlled everything and trusted no one. The truth was simpler and more pathetic. He was just tired. The Grand Cathedral Hall blazed with enough candlelight to burn a village. Cedric entered through the eastern archway and immediately wanted to leave. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of ancient kings receiving divine blessing. Gold veins spiderwebbed through marble pillars, and everywhere he looked, Nobles wore their wealth like armor, silk dresses that cost more than farmland, jewelry that could feed entire towns, smiles that cost nothing and meant less. Duke Vaemont, Lord Chancellor Harwin announced from the central dais, his voice carrying over the chamber orchestra, playing something delicate and forgettable. His Grace, ruler of the Northern Territories, warden of Raventhorn Keep. Conversation died in ripples. Heads turned. The crowd parted like water avoiding poison. Kaedric walked forward, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the young nobles who stepped back instinctively when he passed too close. He wore black, always black, the color of Raventhorn's banners, the color of smoke and burned bridges. No decorations except the Vaemont crest on his chest, a silver wolf's head with rubies for eyes. Simple, direct. Everything his reputation claimed he wasn't. Your Grace, a woman's voice, honey sweet and calculated. Lady Celestine Thorne approached from his left, draped in emerald silk, her smile perfect and empty. How wonderful to see you again. It's been far too long since you've graced the capital with your presence. Not long enough, Kedrick said. She laughed like he'd made a joke. I've heard the most fascinating rumors about developments in the north. Perhaps we could discuss trade opportunities over wine later? Perhaps you could discuss them with my trade ministers and save us both the time. He moved past her before she could respond. Behind him, he heard her laugh again, sharper this time, the sound of someone swallowing humiliation and pretending it tasted fine. He didn't care. Caring required energy. He refused to waste on people who saw him as a stepping stone toward power they would never be strong enough to hold. The ballroom stretched ahead in a maze of conversation circles and political theater. Kaedric recognized the players. Duke Aldrich Thorne negotiating something with the royal trade minister. Count Vaemar laughing too loud with visiting dignitaries from the eastern provinces. Lord Harwick watching everything with the expression of a man betting on horses that hadn't been born yet. Predators. All of them. Eating each other slowly while calling it civilization. Cassian. The voice came from behind, low and familiar. Kedrick turned. Lady Evelyn Morcant stood close enough that her perfume reached him, something dark with jasmine and smoke. She wore deep purple that matched her eyes. Her black hair swept back to expose the elegant line of her neck, her expression caught between amusement and something harder to name. Beautiful in the way sharpened steel was beautiful, designed to cut, polished to perfection. They'd known each other for 7 years, longer than any alliance he'd maintained. She understood the game better than most of the men in this room, played it with surgical precision, and never once pretended their relationship was anything except two people using each other for strategic advantage. Evelyn, he said, you look miserable. I am miserable. Good. It means you're paying attention. She moved beside him, close enough to suggest intimacy without demanding it. Half the room is placing bets on which family will successfully marry into House Vaemont before spring. The odds are not in anyone's favor. Tell them to save their money. I did. They ignored me. She glanced across the hall toward a cluster of young women clearly positioned to intercept him. Lady Margot Grieve has been practicing her smile in mirrors for 3 weeks. Lady Sienna Corvent hired a tutor to teach her northern dialects. And Lady Celestine's father just purchased land bordering your eastern territories, which I'm sure is purely coincidental. Kedrick said nothing. Marriage. The word sat in his chest like a stone. Everyone wanted access to his power, his wealth, his influence. Nobody wanted the reality underneath, the sleepless nights reviewing tax records, the impossible decisions about who lived and died during famines, the loneliness that felt like drowning in a room full of people who would smile while he drowned. You should choose someone, Evelyn said quietly, or they'll choose for you. I'd rather burn the keep to the ground. That can be arranged. She touched his arm, brief and controlled. Dance with me. Give the court something to gossip about that isn't completely insufferable. He didn't want to dance, but he also didn't want to stand alone while predators circled, so he followed her onto the floor where other couples moved through formal patterns choreographed generations ago. The orchestra swelled. Kaedrick took Evelyn's hand, feeling the calluses on her palm. She practiced with blades when she thought no one was watching, and they moved together with the mechanical grace of people who'd performed this exact dance dozens of times before. You're distracted, she said. I'm always distracted. More than usual. What happened in the north? The usual. Famine, disease, smugglers stealing medicine while children die in quarantine camps. Nothing worth discussing at a party. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. You can't save everyone, Cassian. I'm not trying to save everyone. I'm trying to stop people from dying for no reason except someone else's greed. That's the same thing. No, it's not. They turned through the pattern. Around them, other couples danced and smiled and pretended they weren't constantly calculating advantage. Above them, the chandeliers burned bright enough to hide shadows. The crown is worried about you, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. There are rumors you're consolidating too much power in the north, that you're building an independent military force. The crown should focus on governing instead of spreading rumors. I'm serious. There are people in this room who want you destroyed. Not humiliated, not demoted, destroyed. Let them try. She met his eyes. That's not strategy, that's pride. Maybe, but pride keeps me alive when fear would get me killed. The song ended. They separated. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment longer, something like concern flickering across her face before she masked it with the perfect smile she wore for everyone else. Choose carefully, Cassian. The next move you make will define everything that comes after. Then she walked away, disappearing into the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who understood exactly how to vanish when visibility became dangerous. Kadric stood alone on the edge of the dance floor, surrounded by music and light and the suffocating weight of people who needed things from him he didn't know how to give. Then he saw her. She entered through the northern archway like she owned the room and just hadn't bothered mentioning it to anyone yet. Silver silk caught the candlelight as she moved, but it wasn't the dress that made people stare. It was the way she carried herself, shoulders back, chin level, eyes scanning the hall with the detached interest of someone evaluating threats and dismissing them before they became problems. Dark hair swept back from a face that could have been beautiful if she'd softened it, but she didn't. Sharp cheekbones, pale skin, a mouth set in a line that suggested she'd already heard every lie this room had to offer and wasn't interested in hearing them again. Lady Seraphine Arden, someone whispered nearby. Surprised they let her show her face here. Kadric knew the name. Everyone did. House Arden had collapsed 2 years ago in a spectacular mess of gambling debts and failed investments. The father died drunk. The mother disappeared into a convent. The daughter got sold to Marquis Aldrin Grieve to settle accounts. A transaction that surprised no one because noble families had been trading daughters like currency since kingdoms learned how to write contracts. But Seraphine Arden didn't move like someone who'd been bought. She moved like someone who'd agreed to a deal and was already planning how to renegotiate the terms. The crowd parted as she walked through the hall. Not from respect, from something closer to morbid curiosity, the way people stepped back to watch a house burn. She ignored them, her focus fixed on the far side of the room where Marquis Grieve held court with other aging nobles. His face flushed from wine, his hands gesturing too broadly while he told some story nobody actually cared about. Kedrick watched her approach the Marquise, watched the old man's expression shift from surprise to something uglier, possession mixed with satisfaction. Grieve reached for her arm. She stepped back just enough to make his movement look clumsy, then leaned close and whispered something that made his smile freeze. Interesting. Kedrick crossed the hall, moving through clusters of conversation without acknowledging anyone. When he reached the Marquis, Grieve was already red-faced and angry, his voice rising above the chamber music. "You'll show proper respect, girl, or I'll have you removed from this gathering and every other one until you learn your place." Seraphine's expression didn't change. "My place is wherever I choose to stand. If that's a problem for you, perhaps you should have read the contract more carefully before signing it." The surrounding nobles went quiet, attention shifting like sharks sensing blood. Kedrick stopped beside them. "Marquis Grieve, Lady Arden." Grieve's anger evaporated, replaced by nervous deference. "Your Grace, I didn't see you. We were just having a small disagreement about nothing important," Seraphine interrupted, her voice calm and cutting. "The Marquis was explaining his expectations for our future together. I was explaining why his expectations need adjustment." Kedrick looked at her directly for the first time. She looked back. No lowered eyes, no polite deference. Just cold assessment, like she was measuring him for weaknesses the same way he measured everyone else. It disturbed something in his chest, a sensation he couldn't immediately name because he'd spent years making sure he never felt anything in rooms like this except controlled detachment. "The Marquis owns considerable land in the eastern valleys," Kedrick said, his voice neutral. Strategic position, useful during trade disputes. He also owns considerable debt in the capital, Seraphine replied. Less useful during actual governing. Greaves' face went purple. Your Grace, I apologize for this unseemly display. The girl has no understanding of proper... The girl has a name, Seraphine said quietly. And she's standing right here, so perhaps direct your apologies towards someone who actually deserves them. Silence spread through the immediate area like frost. Kedrick studied her. Most people who challenged authority in public were either stupid or desperate. She seemed neither. Instead, she radiated the specific kind of control that came from someone who'd already lost everything and discovered that fear died with security. Your Grace, Greaves started again, but Kedrick raised one hand and the Marquis stopped talking mid-sentence. Lady Arden, Kedrick said, you object to this arrangement. I object to being treated like property in a transaction I wasn't permitted to negotiate. You were permitted. You just didn't have leverage. Exactly, which is why I'm creating some. The boldness stunned him, not because it was unusual, he'd seen desperate nobles say desperate things before, but because she said it without desperation, like she genuinely believed she could renegotiate a deal with one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom through sheer force of will. What leverage do you believe you possess? Kedrick asked. Seraphine smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression he'd seen all night. The kind you're currently considering because this conversation is far more interesting than anything else happening in this room. She was right, and that was a problem. Kedrick looked at Greaves. The Marquis was sweating now, his hands clenched at his sides, caught between fury and the survival instinct that warned him against antagonizing the Duke in public. The arrangement between House Arden and House Greaves is dissolved, Kedrick said. The words fell like stones into water. Ripples spread. Conversation stopped. Every eye in the immediate area focused on the Duke. Your Grace, Greaves managed, his voice strangled, we have a binding contract, which I'm overruling. Consider it compensation for the Eastern tariffs you've been avoiding for 6 months. You can't... I can. I did. Leave. Greaves opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out except a sound halfway between protest and surrender. Then he turned and pushed through the crowd, his dignity shredding with every step. Kedrick looked at Seraphine. She hadn't moved, hadn't thanked him. Just watched him with that same cold assessment, like she was trying to determine whether she'd escaped one cage by walking into another. You're welcome, Kedrick said. I didn't thank you. I noticed. Because I don't know what you want yet. Smart. What makes you think I want anything? Everyone wants something, Your Grace. The only question is whether they're honest about it. She was right again, and Kedrick felt something sharp and uncomfortable twist in his chest. Not attraction exactly, but recognition. The way a predator recognized another predator. The way someone who'd spent years alone in rooms full of people recognized someone else who understood that loneliness wasn't about being surrounded by crowds. It was about being surrounded by people who couldn't see you. Lady Seraphine Arden will marry me instead, Kedrick announced, his voice carrying across the hall. The ballroom went silent, absolutely, completely silent. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the part that still believed in caution and strategy was screaming at him to stop talking. But the rest of him, the part that had learned to trust instinct over calculation, kept going. The wedding will take place in 3 weeks at Raventhorn Keep. Attendance is encouraged but not required. Lady Arden, you're dismissed. He walked away before she could respond, before the court could react, before his own decision finished processing in his brain. Behind him, chaos erupted in whispers and gasps, and the specific kind of shock that happened when someone powerful did something inexplicable. Kedrick pushed through the crowd, ignoring questions, ignoring stares, ignoring Evelyn's expression of frozen horror as he passed her position near the eastern columns. He made it to the private corridor beyond the main hall before Captain Torvin caught up with him. Your Grace, what in the bleeding hell's just happened? I have no idea, Kedrick said, and for the first time in 7 years, he was telling the absolute truth. Chesek. The carriage back to Raventhorn took 3 hours through winter roads that wanted to kill them. Kedrick sat in darkness, watching frozen countryside slide past the window while his mind replayed the ballroom scene on endless repeat. He'd just announced his engagement to a woman he'd spoken with for less than 5 minutes. A woman with no family, no fortune, no political connections worth mentioning, A woman who looked at him like she could see straight through the reputation he'd spent years building. Strategically, it made no sense. Emotionally, it made even less. But something about the way Seraphine had stood in that ballroom refusing to lower her eyes had cracked something open inside him. Something he'd kept buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. The memory of what it felt like to meet someone who wasn't performing, wasn't calculating, wasn't playing the game because they already understood the game was rigged and chose defiance anyway. "Your Grace," Torvin said from the opposite seat, "do you want to discuss what happened?" "No." "Are you going to explain it to the council?" "Also no." "They're going to demand an explanation. Then they can demand it." "I'll ignore them the same way I ignore everyone else." Torvin was quiet for a long moment. She challenged the Marquis publicly. "That takes courage or stupidity. And I don't think she's stupid. Neither do I. So what is she?" Kadric stared out the window. "Dangerous." "Was he?" Raventhorn Keep rose against the night sky like something carved from the darkness itself. Kedrick entered through the southern gate, passed through corridors where servants bowed and guards saluted, climbed stairs worn smooth by generations of boots, and finally reached his private chambers where silence waited like an old friend. He poured wine he wouldn't drink, stood at the window overlooking the northern sea, and tried to convince himself he hadn't just made the single worst decision of his entire life. The problem was simple. He'd spent years building control through fear, maintaining power through calculated distance, ruling through the absolute certainty that attachment was weakness and weakness was death. Every relationship was transactional. Every alliance was temporary. Every person in his life existed because they served a purpose. And the moment that purpose expired, they disappeared. But Seraphine Arden had looked at him like she already knew all of that and didn't care. Like she'd seen men like him before and understood that fear wasn't strength. It was just fear wearing better clothes. The door opened without warning. Evelyn stepped inside, her expression carefully controlled in the way that meant she was absolutely furious. "Explain," she said. "There's nothing to explain. You just announced your engagement to a ruined noble you've never met in front of the entire court, without warning, without strategy, without any consideration for how this affects House Vaymont's standing. So try again." Kadric turned from the window. "I don't answer to you, Evelyn. No. But you answer to something, and whatever that something is, it's going to destroy you." She crossed the room, stopping close enough that he could see the anger burning behind her eyes. Evelyn never showed anger. She was too controlled, too disciplined. But something about tonight had cracked her mask, and underneath was something raw and wounded. "I've stood beside you for 7 years," she continued. "I've managed your alliances, protected your interests, played the game you refuse to play because you're too proud to admit it needs playing. And in 7 years, you've never once made a decision this reckless. Maybe I'm tired of careful decisions. Then you're tired of surviving. Maybe." The word hung between them. Evelyn stared at him, searching for something. Reassurance, explanation, the man she thought she understood. But Kadric didn't have any of those things to give. "You're destroying everything we built," she said quietly. "No. I'm destroying everything you think we built. There's a difference." Her hand cracked across his face before he registered the movement. The slap echoed through the chamber. Kedric tasted blood. Evelyn's breathing came sharp and uneven, her carefully maintained control shattered completely. "I loved you," she whispered. "No, you didn't. You loved what I could give you, access, power, security, the same things everyone else loves. But that's not me, Evelyn. That's just the role I play." "And what role does she play? This girl you've known for 5 minutes? I don't know yet. But at least she's honest about not knowing." Evelyn stepped back, her face pale, her hands shaking. When she spoke again, her voice came from somewhere cold and final. "You're going to regret this. Probably. And I'm going to make sure you do." She left before he could respond, the door closing behind her with controlled precision that somehow hurt worse than slamming would have. Kadric remained at the window, one hand pressed against the glass, watching his reflection stare back at him like a stranger. He'd just destroyed a 7-year alliance, announced an impossible marriage, and burned every political bridge he'd spent years building. And the worst part, the absolutely worst part, was that he didn't regret it. Not yet. The letter sat on Kadric's desk like a challenge written in blood. He'd read it 3 times already, each pass revealing nothing except what he already knew. Seraphine Arden wasn't interested in playing the game everyone else played. She wanted honesty, which was the one thing he'd spent his entire adult life learning how to weaponize, bury, or avoid entirely depending on who was asking. The truth about why he chose her. Kedrick poured wine he still wouldn't drink and stared at the words until they stopped making sense. The truth was, he didn't know. Or he knew and refused to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it meant admitting that somewhere beneath the carefully constructed armor of the ruthless Duke, who controlled everything, there existed a man lonely enough to make catastrophically stupid decisions just to feel something other than the endless weight of responsibility. 3 days had passed since the ball. 3 days of council members demanding explanations he didn't give, nobles sending carefully worded congratulations that barely concealed their confusion, and Evelyn maintaining such perfect silence that the entire keep felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the explosion. Now Seraphine was here, waiting in the guest chambers 3 floors below, demanding truth like it was currency he owed her. Kedrick left the study and walked through corridors that had witnessed centuries of Vaymont rule. Stone walls thick enough to swallow sound, torches burning in iron sconces, portraits of ancestors who'd built empires through violence and maintained them through fear. His footsteps echoed. Guards stood at attention when he passed, their expressions locked in the careful neutrality that meant they'd heard rumors and chosen survival over curiosity. He reached the guest wing and stopped outside the chamber where Seraphine waited. Captain Torvin stood nearby, his presence unobtrusive but deliberate. "Has she tried to leave?" Kedrick asked. "No, Your Grace." "She arrived 2 hours ago, dismissed the servants, and hasn't made a sound since." "Smart woman." "Terrifying woman," Torvin corrected quietly. She looked at the keep like she was memorizing exits. "That's what smart looks like when it survives long enough." Kedrick pushed open the door without knocking. Seraphine stood at the window overlooking the northern cliffs, where winter waves hammered black stone with the rhythm of artillery fire. She wore dark gray, practical traveling clothes that suggested she'd packed for function instead of impression. Her hair was pulled back, exposing the line of her jaw, the tension in her shoulders. When she turned to face him, her expression carried no surprise, no fear, nothing except that same cold assessment that had disturbed him at the ball. "Your Grace," she said, "thank you for responding so quickly to my letter. I expected at least a week of strategic avoidance. I don't avoid things. Everyone avoids things. You're just better at pretending you don't." She crossed the room and stopped close enough that he could see the exhaustion beneath her controlled exterior, faint shadows under her eyes, the tightness around her mouth that came from sleeping badly in unfamiliar places. But her voice remained steady, her posture uncompromising. "You asked me to marry you in front of the entire court, without discussion, without negotiation, without any indication that you'd thought about it for longer than the 30 seconds it took to destroy my existing arrangement. So before we proceed with whatever strategic alliance you're actually pursuing, I want the truth, and if I refuse, then I leave. You can explain to the kingdom that the ruthless Duke's engagement lasted 3 days because he couldn't answer one simple question." Kedrick studied her. Most people who demanded truth from him were looking for leverage, searching for weaknesses they could exploit later. But Seraphine's eyes held something different. Not cunning, exactly, but the specific kind of exhaustion that came from surviving too many lies and deciding honesty was worth the risk even when risk meant destruction. "You want to know why I chose you?" he said. "Yes. The honest answer will ruin whatever romantic illusions you might be entertaining about this arrangement. I have no romantic illusions about anything, Your Grace. I'm a ruined noble being traded between powerful men like grain futures. Romance died somewhere between my father drinking himself to death and my mother abandoning me to a convent rather than face bankruptcy." "Good. Then we understand each other." He walked past her to the window, looking out at the sea crashing against stone that had survived 1,000 storms and would survive 1,000 more. Behind him, he felt Seraphine waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned that silence extracted more truth than interrogation ever could. "I chose you because you looked at me like you could see exactly what I am," Kedrick said. "And you weren't impressed. That's it? That's enough. Do you understand how rare that is? Everyone in that ballroom wanted something from me. Power, protection, access to resources they couldn't obtain alone. They looked at the Duke. You looked at the man wearing the title like armor, and you saw straight through to the part of me that knows this entire performance is exhausting and pointless and necessary." Seraphine moved beside him, her reflection appearing in the window glass. "So you chose me because I wasn't playing the game? I chose you because you were playing a different game entirely. One I didn't recognize. and I've spent my entire life learning to recognize games before they destroy me." She was quiet for a moment, processing. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its edge. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 2 years. Don't mistake honesty for kindness. They're completely different. I know. Kindness is what people offer when they want you to lower your guard. Honesty is what happens when someone decides your guard doesn't matter because they're not planning to attack." Exactly. They stood together at the window watching the sea. Kadric felt something shift in the space between them. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition. The way two people who'd survived similar hells acknowledged each other without needing to explain the scars. "Your letter mentioned a condition," Kadric said. "You have my truth. What happens now?" "Now we establish terms. This isn't a negotiation. Everything is a negotiation, Your Grace. You just haven't met anyone willing to negotiate with you before." She turned to face him directly, and for the first time since entering Raventhorn, Seraphine allowed something other than cold control to show in her expression. Determination mixed with the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose. "I will marry you," she said. "I will fulfill whatever public role this arrangement requires. But I won't be another silent, noble wife hidden behind velvet curtains while you rule through fear and call it strength. If I'm going to wear the Vaymont crest, I want real authority. Access to estate records, presence in council meetings, the ability to challenge decisions. I believe are wrong. You want power. I want to matter. There's a difference." Kedrick almost smiled. Most people ask for power by demanding titles, positions, ceremonial authority they could display like jewelry. Seraphine wanted something more dangerous, the ability to affect actual change, to disrupt systems, to become a problem he couldn't solve by simply removing her from the room. "And if I refuse your terms?" "Then you explain to the court that your engagement failed because you're afraid of a woman who asks questions." It was manipulation, clean and direct. She'd identified his weakness, pride, and leveraged it with surgical precision. The smart move was to refuse, maintain control, establish from the beginning that their arrangement would follow his rules and no one else's. But Kaedric hadn't made smart moves since the moment he saw her walk into that ballroom. "You'll have access to estate records," he said. "Presence in council meetings when I deem it strategically appropriate. And the ability to challenge my decisions privately, not publicly. I want—" "Those are my terms, Seraphine. Accept them or leave." She held his gaze, measuring the distance between what she wanted and what he was offering, calculating whether the compromise was worth the concession. Then slowly she nodded. "Acceptable. Good. The wedding is in 3 weeks. Use that time to learn how Raventhorn operates, and understand that the people in this keep aren't your allies. They're predators who will smile while planning your destruction the moment they perceive you as weak. I've survived predators before. Not like these. These predators wear crowns and call themselves family. Then I'll learn to be a better predator." Kaedric turned from the window. "That's the first intelligent thing you've said since arriving." The council meeting started exactly as Kaedric expected, with silence so heavy it felt like drowning. 8 men sat around the ancient oak table in the strategy chamber, their faces illuminated by candlelight that made everyone look like they were already dead, and just hadn't stopped moving yet. Lord Matthias Corwin, Master of Coin. Commander Aldrich Thorne, Head of Raventhorn's military forces. High Steward Brennan Vale. Trade Minister Gareth Linden. 4 other nobles whose primary function was agreeing with whoever held the most power and looking concerned when disagreement seemed fashionable. Kedrick stood at the head of the table, hands braced on dark wood scarred by generations of arguments. "Gentlemen," he said, "I assume you've heard about my engagement." "The entire kingdom has heard about your engagement, Your Grace," Lord Corwin said carefully. "The announcement was rather impossible to miss." "I'm not here to discuss the announcement. I'm here to inform you that Lady Seraphine will be attending future council sessions." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Commander Thorne spoke first, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news to a superior who might shoot the messenger. "Your Grace, with respect, council sessions involve sensitive military intelligence and strategic planning. Allowing an outsider access to—" "She's not an outsider. She's my wife. She will be your wife in 3 weeks. Currently, she's a stranger with no established loyalty to House Vaymont and no experience in governance." "Then she'll learn," Kedrick said. The The same way all of you learned when you first entered these chambers, terrified of making mistakes. We earned our positions through years of service, High Steward Vale interjected. Lady Arden has no comparable experience. Experience is just surviving long enough to make the same mistakes repeatedly while calling it wisdom. Seraphine will attend meetings, observe discussions, and when she has questions, you will answer them with the same courtesy you extend to me. The council members exchanged glances, silent conversations happening in the space between words. Kaedric recognized the pattern. They were calculating whether his decision was temporary insanity or permanent stupidity, trying to determine if opposing him now was worth the consequences later. Your Grace, Lord Corwin said slowly. May I speak frankly? You're going to regardless of my answer. The court is confused. The nobles are uncertain. Allowing your future wife unprecedented access to council proceedings will be interpreted as weakness, especially given her family's recent disgrace. Good. I'm sorry? I said good. Let them interpret it as weakness. Let them believe I'm distracted, compromised, vulnerable. Predators reveal themselves when they think prey is wounded. You're using your own engagement as bait? Commander Thorne's expression shifted from concern to something closer to horrified respect. I'm using everything as bait. That's how you catch traitors before they become rebellions. The chamber fell silent again. Outside, winter wind hammered the walls with the sound of waves trying to tear stone from cliffs. Kaedric remained standing, watching his council process the realization that their duke hadn't made a reckless emotional decision. He'd made a calculated, strategic move they simply hadn't been smart enough to recognize. Lady Arden attends the next council session, Kaedric continued. Anyone who objects can tender their resignation immediately and save us both the time of pretending you'll be useful going forward. No one resigned. No one spoke. Perfect silence that meant absolute compliance born from absolute fear. Kaedric left the chamber before the silence could crack into something resembling conversation. Behind him, he heard whispers starting, voices carefully lowered. The sound of men who'd just realized their understanding of power had shifted, and they needed to recalibrate their calculations before the next move destroyed them. Captain Torvin waited outside, his expression unreadable. How bad? Kaedric asked. They think you've lost your mind. They're not entirely wrong. Are you going to explain the actual strategy? No. The fewer people who understand what I'm doing, the easier it is to identify who's paying attention. They walked through corridors lined with Vaymont history, battle standards from ancient wars, weapons mounted on stone walls, portraits of ancestors who'd conquered through violence and maintained power through strategic marriages that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with accumulating land. Your Grace, Torvin said quietly, Lady Morcant has requested an audience. Denied. She's requesting it daily, multiple times. The servants are becoming uncomfortable with her insistence. Tell them to become comfortable with disappointment. I'm not discussing my engagement with Evelyn now or ever. She's not going to accept silence as an answer. Then she'll learn to accept things she doesn't like. It builds character. But Kaedric knew Torvin was right. Evelyn had spent 7 years believing she understood him, building a vision of their future that depended on him remaining exactly who he'd always been. Controlled, predictable, safely contained within parameters she could manage. His engagement to Seraphine had shattered that vision, and Evelyn was too intelligent and too dangerous to simply accept destruction without attempting reconstruction. She would retaliate. The only question was when and how. Seraphine attended her first council meeting 6 days after arriving at Raventhorn. She entered the strategy chamber wearing dark blue that matched the Vaymont colors, her hair pinned back with silver clasps, her expression revealing nothing except focused attention. The council members stood when she entered, basic courtesy that felt forced and uncomfortable. She acknowledged them with a nod and took the empty chair Kaedric had positioned directly across from his own position at the table. Gentlemen, Kaedric said, Lady Arden is observing today's session. Continue as you normally would. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Lord Corwin cleared his throat and opened the leather portfolio in front of him. Your Grace, the quarterly financial reports from the Northern Territories show continued strain. Crop failures in the eastern valleys have reduced tax revenue by 18%. Medical expenses for the quarantine zones have exceeded projections by 30,000 marks. Reallocate funds from the ceremonial budget, Kaedric said. Cancel the spring festivals and redirect everything to medical supplies. Your Grace, That will cause significant public dissatisfaction. The festivals are tradition. Tradition doesn't cure plague. Make it happen. Seraphine leaned forward slightly, her attention fixed on the papers spread across the table. May I see the financial breakdown? Lord Corwin's expression flickered with surprise, then settled into practiced neutrality. Of course, my lady. He slid the portfolio across the table. Seraphine studied it with the focused intensity of someone reading a language they'd taught themselves, her fingers tracing columns of numbers, her eyes moving between expenditures and revenue streams. The ceremonial budget includes 40,000 marks for the Duke's personal household, she said. That seems excessive given the current crisis. The household budget covers essential operations, Lord Corwin explained, his tone hovering between patient and condescending. Staff salaries, maintenance, security. How much of that 40,000 goes directly to staff salaries? Approximately 12,000. Then the remaining 28,000 is being spent on what exactly? Polishing marble that no one sees? Importing wine that no one drinks? Maintaining rooms that remain empty? The chamber went absolutely silent. Kaedric watched the council members' faces, seeing calculations happening behind their eyes. Seraphine had identified waste in a budget that had remained unchallenged for years, exposing inefficiency they'd either ignored or deliberately concealed. It was the kind of question that made powerful men uncomfortable because it suggested someone was paying attention to details they'd assumed remained invisible. Lady Arden raises a valid concern, Kaedric said. Lord Corwin, reduce the household budget by 15,000 marks and reallocate to medical supplies. If the keep's marble loses its shine, we'll survive. Your Grace, that will require significant operational changes. Then start changing operations. This meeting is over. The council members stood gathering papers, their movements stiff with barely concealed frustration. As they filed out, Kaedric caught the glances they exchanged. Silent acknowledgement that the Duke's future wife was going to be a problem, and problems required solutions. Seraphine remained seated, still studying the financial reports. You made enemies just now, Kaedric said once they were alone. Good. That means I asked the right questions. Asking the right questions gets people killed, only if they're afraid of the answers. She looked up, meeting his eyes. You told me to learn how Raventhorn operates. I'm learning that it operates inefficiently, with bloated budgets protecting comfortable corruption while people die from curable diseases because medicine is expensive and festivals are tradition. You're not wrong. Then why haven't you fixed it? Because fixing corruption requires destroying the people who benefit from it, and those people control the infrastructure that keeps this entire territory functioning. Remove them, and the system collapses. Replace them, and you just install new predators who learn to hide the corruption better. So you accept inefficiency because dismantling it costs more than tolerating it? I accept inefficiency because I'm choosing battles I can win instead of battles that feel righteous. There's a difference. Seraphine closed the portfolio, her expression shifting from analytical to something harder to read, disappointment mixed with understanding. That's the difference between ruling and governing, she said quietly. You rule through fear because it's efficient, but you don't actually govern because governing requires caring about outcomes beyond your own survival. The words hit harder than Kaedric expected, cutting through the armor he'd built around the parts of himself he didn't examine too closely. She wasn't wrong. He'd spent years maintaining power while telling himself that maintenance was the same as leadership, that keeping people alive was sufficient even when those people remained trapped in systems designed to extract their labor while offering nothing except the privilege of continued existence. You think I don't care? Kaedric said, his voice low and dangerous. I think you care very much. I think that's what terrifies you. Caring means acknowledging that your power comes with responsibility beyond simply keeping yourself alive. And responsibility means accepting that you can't control everything no matter how much fear you generate. She stood, smoothing her dress, preparing to leave. Where are you going? Kaedric asked. To continue learning how this keep operates. You gave me access to records. I'm using it. Stay away from the Eastern Archives. They contain intelligence reports that could get you killed if the wrong people discover you've seen them. Then perhaps you should improve security instead of warning me away from information I'm entitled to access under the terms we agreed upon. She left before he could respond. Kaedric remained in the strategy chamber, surrounded by maps of territories he controlled and reports documenting problems he managed, and for the first time in years, he felt something uncomfortably close to inadequacy. Seraphine had been at Raventhorn for less than a week, and she'd already identified the central failure he'd spent years avoiding, that ruling through fear was easy, but governing with actual purpose required vulnerability. He'd trained himself to consider weakness, and vulnerability got people killed. He'd learned that lesson young, watching his father die from trusting the wrong ally, seeing his mother destroyed by grief that turned into madness. Love was a weapon. Attachment was leverage. The moment you cared about something, you gave the world permission to destroy you through it. Better to remain alone. Safer to trust nothing except power. But standing in that empty chamber, Kadric felt the weight of that safety pressing down like stone on his chest, suffocating and absolute. But the assassination attempt happened on the 15th day. Kadric was reviewing border patrol reports in his study when the door exploded inward, wood splintering around the lock. 3 men in black moved through the opening with the practiced efficiency of trained killers, knives drawn, faces covered, movements synchronized in a way that suggested military training and significant funding. Kadric's blade cleared its sheath before conscious thought registered the threat. He killed the first attacker with a thrust through the throat, used the falling body as a shield against the second, and drove his boot into the third man's knee hard enough to hear bone crack. The injured man went down screaming. The remaining attacker lunged with a curved blade aimed at Kadric's ribs. The knife scored his side, cutting through fabric and skin. Pain bloomed hot and immediate. Kadric grabbed the attacker's wrist, twisted until joints separated with wet popping sounds, and drove his own blade up through the soft tissue beneath the jaw into the brain. The attacker collapsed. Silence rushed back into the study, broken only by the injured man's whimpering and Kadric's harsh breathing. Guards arrived seconds later, flooding the chamber with steel and shouted commands. Captain Torvin moved through them, his expression locked in the careful neutrality that meant he was absolutely furious beneath the professional exterior. "Your Grace, are you hurt?" Kadric pressed his hand against his side, feeling blood seep between his fingers. Nothing fatal. The injured attacker was being restrained by guards. His broken leg bent at an angle that made Seraphine gasp when she appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock that quickly hardened into something colder. "What happened?" she demanded. "Someone tried to kill me," Kadric said, his voice steady despite the pain radiating from his ribs. "It happens occasionally." "Occasionally?" "Often enough that I've stopped being surprised." She crossed the study, stepping over bodies without hesitation, and reached for his hand where it pressed against the wound. "Let me see." "I'm fine. You're bleeding." "That's not fine. It's a scratch." "Kadric, let me see the wound or I swear I'll make the injury worse myself." He moved his hand. The cut wasn't deep, maybe 4 inches long, bleeding steadily but not arterially. Seraphine examined it with the focused attention of someone who'd seen wounds before, her fingers gentle but efficient as she checked for foreign objects embedded in the tissue. "You need a physician," she said. "I need answers. Torvin, interrogate the survivor. Find out who paid for this, who planned it, and who else in this keep knew it was happening. Your Grace, now." Torvin signaled the guards. They hauled the injured man from the study, his screams fading as they dragged him toward the dungeons, where questions got answered through methods that didn't involve courtesy. Seraphine remained close, one hand still resting against Kadric's arm. "You could have died." "But I didn't." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" "The point is that 15 days ago you announced our engagement in front of the entire court, and now someone is trying to kill you. Those events are connected, and you know it." She was right, and Kadric felt anger burning beneath the pain, not at Seraphine, but at himself for being reckless enough to believe announcing their engagement wouldn't accelerate existing threats. Someone had interpreted his decision as weakness or distraction, decided the Duke was vulnerable, and moved quickly to exploit that vulnerability before it closed. The question was who? "Evelyn," Seraphine said quietly, reading his expression. "You think she arranged this?" "I don't think anything yet. But she has motive, resources, and 7 years of understanding exactly how to breach Raventhorn's defenses. Then we need to confront her. No, we need proof. Accusations without evidence just warn guilty people to hide better. So what do? We wait. And we watch. And when whoever planned this makes their next move, we'll be ready." Seraphine's hand tightened on his arm. "I won't let them kill you." The certainty in her voice startled him. They'd known each other for 15 days. barely spoken outside of council meetings and brief encounters in corridors. Yet she spoke with the absolute conviction of someone who'd already decided his survival mattered more than her safety, and that decision disturbed something deep in Kedrick's chest, the part of him that had learned to equate protection with control, that believed keeping people at a distance was the only way to keep them alive. Why? He asked. Why does it matter to you if I live or die? Because you're the first person in 2 years who's been honest with me, and I'd rather marry an honest monster than a polite liar. I'm not a monster. Yes, you are. You've just convinced yourself that monsters are necessary in a world designed to destroy anything weak enough to show mercy. She was right again, cutting through pretense with the brutal efficiency of someone who understood that truth only mattered when it hurt. The door opened. A physician entered with supplies, followed by servants carrying clean bandages and heated water. Seraphine stepped back, allowing them space to work, but her eyes never left Kedrick's face. He held her gaze while the physician cleaned the wound, feeling pain sharp enough to make his vision blur at the edges. But worse than the physical pain was the realization growing in his chest like a tumor he couldn't cut out. That somewhere in the past 15 days, Seraphine had stopped being a strategic decision and started becoming something far more dangerous. Someone he actually cared about keeping alive. And caring meant vulnerability. And vulnerability meant weakness. And weakness would get them both killed. Megs. The interrogation lasted 4 hours. When Torvin finally emerged from the dungeons, his uniform was splattered with blood, and his expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone who'd extracted information through methods that would haunt his sleep for weeks. Kedrick waited in the throne hall, standing before the massive windows overlooking the sea. Seraphine sat nearby, her presence a quiet anchor in the darkness. Neither had spoken much since the physician finished stitching the wound, both processing the reality that someone inside Raventhorn wanted the Duke dead badly enough to hire professional killers. Your Grace, Torvin said. We have answers. Tell me. The attack was funded by Lord Harwick Vale, coordinated through a network of mercenaries operating out of the capital. The plan was to eliminate you during a moment of perceived vulnerability, install Lord Matthias Corwin as temporary regent, and dissolve your engagement to Lady Arden before the wedding could take place. Kedrick felt rage settle into his bones like ice. Harwick Vale. A minor noble with significant gambling debts and even more significant ambitions. Someone he'd overlooked because the man seemed too incompetent to pose a real threat. Fatal mistake. Where's Vale now? Kedrick asked. In custody. We arrested him an hour ago, along with 3 co-conspirators, including 2 members of your household staff. And Corwin? Claims ignorance. Says he had no knowledge of the plot and would never support regicide. Do you believe him? No. But we have no evidence connecting him directly to the assassination attempt. Kedrick turned from the window. Then we create evidence. Your Grace, Vale will confess to Corwin's involvement, publicly, in front of the entire court, and Corwin will either confirm the confession or spend the rest of his life in the dungeons wondering when I'll decide his denials have stopped being useful. Seraphine stood, moving beside him. That's not justice. No, it's strategy. Justice is what happens when you have the luxury of caring about fairness. I don't have that luxury. You're condemning a man who might be innocent. I'm protecting a territory that will collapse into chaos if people believe they can assassinate me without consequences severe enough to make future attempts suicidal. She studied him, and Kedrick saw something shift behind her eyes. Not horror exactly, but a kind of resigned understanding. She was watching him transform from the honest man who'd admitted he chose her because she saw through his armor into the ruthless duke who ruled through fear because fear was the only language power understood. You're proving my point, she said quietly. You rule, but you don't govern. I keep people alive. That's governing. No, that's control. Governing requires building systems that function even after you're gone. What you're describing is maintaining power through terror, and terror only lasts as long as you do. Then I'll last as long as necessary. He turned to Torvin. Execute Vale at dawn, public display in the central courtyard. Make sure every noble in the territory understands what happens when someone tries to kill me. And Corwin? House arrest until I decide he's suffered enough to be credible when he swears loyalty. Yes, Your Grace. Torvin left. Seraphine remained, her presence accusatory in its silence. Say it, Kedrick told her. Say what? Whatever you're thinking. You've been transparent about everything else. I'm thinking that you are so terrified of weakness, you've built a fortress out of cruelty and called it strength. And the tragedy is that you're smart enough to know better but too damaged to choose differently. The words cut deeper than the assassin's blade. Kedrick felt something crack in his chest, the careful control he'd maintained his entire adult life fracturing under the weight of someone seeing him clearly and refusing to look away. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Yes, I do. I see exactly what you are. Someone who watched people he loved destroyed by mercy and decided that love itself was the enemy. So you built walls instead of relationships, chose fear instead of trust, and convinced yourself that surviving alone was the same as winning. Stop. No. Because someone needs to tell you that you're destroying yourself trying to protect everyone else. And that's not strength. It's just a different kind of weakness wearing better armor." Kedrick closed the distance between them, his hands gripping her shoulders hard enough to bruise. "You have no idea what it costs to keep people alive in a world designed to destroy anyone vulnerable enough to show compassion. Then show me. Stop ruling through fear and start trusting that maybe, just maybe, you're not the only person capable of surviving in this world." She held his gaze, unflinching, and Kedrick felt the walls he'd built crumbling under the sustained pressure of someone who refused to accept his isolation as inevitable. He kissed her. Not gently, not romantically, with the desperate fury of someone drowning who'd just been offered air. Seraphine kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer even as he tried to maintain the distance that kept him safe. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kedrick felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of himself. He'd spent years believing attachment was weakness, but standing there with Seraphine's hand still gripping his shirt, her eyes reflecting the same terrified determination he felt burning in his own chest, Kedrick realized the truth was more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Attachment wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made strength worth having, and that realization was going to destroy everything he'd built, or save it. He just didn't know which yet. The letter sat on Kedrick's desk like a curse made physical. 3 words. Evelyn's handwriting, ink the color of blood that had dried long enough to turn black at the edges. "You chose wrong." Kedrick stared at the paper until the words stopped having meaning and became just shapes, threats compressed into language too simple to contain the violence they promised. Outside his study windows, dawn light cut across the northern sea in shades of gray and red, illuminating waves that crashed against black cliffs with the rhythm of warfare that never ended and never would. He'd known this was coming. The moment he announced his engagement to Seraphine, he'd understood that Evelyn wouldn't accept destruction quietly. She was too intelligent for simple revenge, too disciplined for emotional outbursts. Whatever she planned would be surgical, devastating, and timed precisely to cause maximum damage when he was least prepared to defend against it. The question wasn't if she would retaliate. The question was how many people would die when she did. Kedrick picked up the letter, studying it under lamplight. The paper was expensive, cream-colored with watermarks from the capital's finest stationers. The seal had been broken cleanly, suggesting whoever delivered it had done so with Evelyn's explicit permission rather than intercepting correspondence meant to remain private. A message within the message. She wanted him to know this wasn't secret communication. It was a declaration. He crossed to the fireplace and held the paper above flames that consumed it in seconds, turning threat into ash. Behind him, the study door opened without warning. Seraphine entered wearing dark green, her hair still damp from bathing, her expression carrying the residual tension of someone who hadn't slept well. She stopped when she saw him standing at the fireplace, reading something in his posture that made her voice sharpen with concern. "What happened?" "Nothing that changes anything." "Kedrick, I can see your hand shaking from here. What happened?" He looked down. She was right. His hands trembled with the fine muscle tension that came from adrenaline he couldn't discharge, rage he couldn't express, fear he refused to acknowledge because acknowledging it meant admitting that somewhere beneath the armor of the ruthless Duke, he was terrified of losing the one thing he'd finally allowed himself to want. "Evelyn sent a letter," he said. 3 words. "You chose wrong." Seraphine crossed the study, moving into the space beside him. "That's a threat. That's a promise. Then we need to prepare. Increase security, restrict access to the keep, interrogate anyone who's been in contact with her. It won't matter. Evelyn's been inside Raventhorn's defenses for 7 years. She knows every secret passage, every guard rotation, every vulnerability I've tried to hide. If she's decided to destroy me, security won't stop her. It'll just delay the inevitable. So what do we do? Kaedric stared into the flames. We wait. And when she makes her move, we respond with enough violence that no one ever considers betraying House Vaemon again. That's not a plan. That's just anger pretending to be strategy. Maybe. But anger has kept me alive longer than careful planning ever did. Seraphine's hand found his, her fingers lacing through his with gentle pressure that somehow hurt worse than any wound. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Yes, I do. Because the moment I start depending on someone else for survival, I give the world permission to destroy me through them. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you that whether you like it or not, we're in this together now. Your enemies are my enemies. Your battles are my battles. And if Evelyn wants to destroy you, she'll have to go through me first. The certainty in her voice was absolute, terrifying, and completely genuine. Kaedric felt something crack in his chest. Not weakness exactly, but the recognition that isolation wasn't strength. It was just loneliness wearing armor heavy enough to crush the person carrying it. He pulled her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, steady and real and alive in a way that made everything else feel temporary. If she comes for me, Kaedric said quietly, promise you'll run. No. Seraphine? No. I didn't survive 2 years of watching my family collapse, my future get sold to the highest bidder, and my identity get reduced to a transaction just to run when things get dangerous. I stayed. I fought. And I'm still here. So whatever Evelyn is planning, we face it together or not at all. She pulled back enough to meet his eyes, and Kaedric saw steel behind the exhaustion, the kind of strength that came from being broken and choosing to rebuild instead of surrender. Together, she repeated. And Kaedric, who'd spent his entire adult life learning to trust nothing except his own capacity for violence, nodded, together. The attack came 3 days later during the council session. Kaedric sat at the head of the strategy table, reviewing supply reports from the Eastern Territories while Lord Corwin droned through financial projections that everyone already knew were optimistic lies designed to conceal corruption. Rain hammered the windows. Candles flickered in drafts that slipped through stone walls built to withstand sieges but never quite managed to keep out the cold. Seraphine sat across from him, listening with the focused attention of someone learning a new language, occasionally asking questions that made the council members uncomfortable because her questions exposed assumptions they'd stopped examining years ago. Commander Thorne was mid-sentence explaining why the military budget required expansion when the eastern door exploded inward, not opened. Exploded. The concussive force knocked 2 council members from their chairs. Smoke billowed through the opening. Through the haze came figures in black armor, moving with military precision, crossbows raised and aimed at the table with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd trained for this specific scenario. 12 men, professional, funded. And leading them, her face uncovered and expression carved from ice, was Lady Evelyn Morcant. Kaedric's hand went to his blade, but 3 crossbow bolts were already trained on his chest before the weapon cleared its sheath. Around the table, guards reacted too slowly, hindered by the smoke and the shock of seeing a coordinated assault inside Raventhorn's most secure chamber. "Don't," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through chaos with absolute authority. "Move, and everyone in this room dies. Stay seated, and we can discuss terms like civilized people." Kaedric remained still, calculating angles, counting attackers, measuring the distance between himself and the nearest cover. Beside him, Seraphine had frozen in her chair, her face pale but her eyes sharp and focused on Evelyn with the intensity of someone memorizing every detail for future reference. The council members sat paralyzed by fear so visceral it turned them into statues. Evelyn walked forward, her boots clicking against stone, her posture relaxed in the way that suggested absolute confidence in her control of the situation. She stopped at the opposite end of the table, close enough that Kaedric could see the rage burning behind her carefully maintained composure. 7 years, she said. 7 years I stood beside you, Cassian, managed your alliances, protected your interests, played the game you refused to play because you were too proud to admit it. Needed playing. And you destroyed all of it for a girl you've known for 3 weeks. This isn't about Seraphine, Kaedric said, his voice steady despite the crossbows aimed at his vital organs. This is about you believing you owned something that was never yours to begin with. I earned my place beside you. You occupied space. There's a difference. Evelyn's expression flickered, rage cracking through the ice for just a moment before she reasserted control. I loved you. No, you loved what I represented. Power. Access. The fantasy that standing beside the Duke made you untouchable. But love requires seeing the actual person underneath the title. And you never looked that deep, because you never let anyone look that deep. You built walls, Cassian, and then you punished people for not climbing them. The words hit harder than Kaedric expected, cutting through defensive anger to expose something uncomfortably close to truth. He had built walls, deliberately, methodically, using isolation as a weapon against vulnerability because vulnerability got people killed and he'd watched. Too many people die to risk caring about anyone enough to make their survival matter more than strategy. But Seraphine had climbed those walls anyway, without permission, without invitation. Just pure stubborn refusal to accept that distance was the same as safety. And that had terrified Evelyn enough to orchestrate this. What do you want? Kedrick asked. Everything you took from me. Starting with her. Evelyn gestured toward Seraphine. Two of the armored soldiers moved forward, grabbing Seraphine's arms and hauling her from the chair before anyone could react. She didn't scream, didn't struggle, just kept her eyes locked on Kaedric with an expression that said, "Trust me," even though nothing about this situation suggested trust was a viable strategy. Let her go, Kaedric said, his voice dropping into the register that made experienced soldiers reconsider their life choices. No. Because you need to understand what it feels like to watch something you care about get destroyed while you sit there helpless. The same way I watched you destroy 7 years of my life without hesitation. This isn't about revenge. This is about wounded pride. Call it whatever you want. The result is the same. She nodded to the soldiers holding Seraphine. They dragged her toward the shattered doorway, boots scraping against stone, crossbows still trained on the council members to prevent interference. Kedric's mind raced through scenarios, calculating possibilities, measuring the cost of each potential action. He could attack, maybe kill 3 soldiers before the crossbows killed him. He could negotiate, offer Evelyn something valuable enough to make her reconsider. He could surrender, trade himself for Seraphine's safety, and hope that whatever happened next didn't result in both of them dead. None of the options were good. All of them ended in blood. Wait, Seraphine said, her voice cutting through the tension. Lady Morcant, you said you want what he took from you. But what exactly did he take? 7 years of standing beside a man who never promised you anything except strategic alliance? 7 years of building fantasies about a future he never confirmed? Or 7 years of choosing to stay because leaving meant admitting you'd invested in something that was never going to return the profit you expected? Evelyn's expression went absolutely cold. You don't understand anything, girl. I understand that you're not angry because he chose me. You're angry because he chose himself. Because for the first time in 7 years, he made a decision that prioritized what he wanted over what was strategically optimal. And that terrifies you because it means all the time you spent managing his image, protecting his interests, playing the perfect political partner. None of it mattered. He didn't choose based on strategy. He chose based on something you couldn't calculate or control. Silence filled the chamber, broken only by rain against windows and the harsh breathing of soldiers maintaining crossbow tension. Kedrick stared at Seraphine, seeing her stand there with armed men gripping her shoulders, facing down a woman who'd orchestrated a military assault inside the most fortified keep in the Northern Territories, and instead of begging for mercy or playing victim, she was dismantling Evelyn's justifications with the surgical precision of someone who understood that the most dangerous battles weren't fought with weapons. They were fought with truth. Evelyn's hand moved to the blade at her hip, fingers wrapping around the hilt with white knuckle pressure. You think you're clever. You think understanding his psychology makes you special. But you're just another transaction, Seraphine. A strategic move he made to feel something other than the emptiness he's spent years pretending doesn't exist. And when that feeling fades, and it will fade, you'll realize you traded your entire future for temporary warmth from a man who doesn't know how to maintain anything except control. Maybe, Seraphine said, but at least I chose this knowing exactly what I was trading for. You spent 7 years hoping he would change into someone he was never going to become. That's not love. That's just prolonged delusion with better funding. Evelyn drew her blade. The movement was smooth, practiced, deadly. She closed the distance between herself and Seraphine in 3 strides, the edge of her weapon coming to rest against Seraphine's throat with enough pressure to draw a thin line of blood. Kadric stood, ignoring the crossbows that tracked his movement. Evelyn, stop. Why? You've already chosen. Now watch what that choice costs. If you kill her, I will spend the rest of my life hunting down everyone you've ever cared about and destroying them completely. That your family name becomes a cautionary tale parents use to frighten children into obedience. Evelyn smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Kadric had seen in his entire life. Pure rage transformed into something sharp enough to cut reality. You think I care about preservation? You think I have anything left worth protecting? You destroyed my future, Cassian. I'm just returning the favor. The blade pressed deeper. Blood ran down Seraphine's neck, staining the collar of her dress. But her eyes never left Kadric's face, and in them he saw something that made his chest constrict with pain, so intense it felt like his ribs were collapsing. Absolute trust mixed with absolute forgiveness for whatever happened next. She'd told him they were in this together. She'd meant it. And now she was going to die because he'd been stupid enough to believe he could have something beyond survival without it being used as a weapon against him. Do it, Kadric said, his voice hollow. Kill her. Prove that you're exactly as broken as I always knew you were, and then spend whatever's left of your life remembering that the only thing you accomplished was confirming that I was right to choose someone else. Evelyn's hand trembled. The blade wavered. For 5 seconds that felt like centuries, nothing moved except rain against windows and blood down Seraphine's throat. Then Evelyn stepped back, lowering the weapon, her expression shifting from rage to something far more dangerous, disappointed resignation. You're not worth it, she said quietly. Either of you. This entire kingdom. None of it is worth the energy I've wasted trying to matter to people who are too damaged to recognize value when it's standing right beside them. She turned to her soldiers. We're leaving. Kill anyone who follows. The armed men retreated through the shattered doorway, dragging Seraphine with them, their movements coordinated and efficient. Within seconds, the chamber was empty except for council members frozen in shock, and Kadric standing alone at the head of the table, feeling something fundamental shatter inside his chest. Seraphine was gone. Evelyn had taken her, and every instinct he'd built over years of surviving through calculated violence was screaming at him to pursue, to attack, to burn the entire world down until he found the woman who'd somehow become more important than strategy. But the rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through countless attempts on his life, understood the trap. Evelyn wanted him to follow, wanted him compromised by emotion, acting on impulse instead of calculation. She'd set the board perfectly, using Seraphine as bait to lure him into making the kind of reckless decision that would expose him to threats he couldn't defend against while focused entirely on rescue. Your Grace, Commander Thorne said, his voice shaking. What are your orders? Kadric stared at the empty doorway, watching rain blow through the shattered entrance. Lock down the keep. No one enters or leaves without my explicit permission. Mobilize every soldier we have. I want search parties in every direction within the hour. Sir, if we disperse our forces, do it. The commander left, shouting orders that echoed through corridors already flooding with guards responding to the attack. The remaining council members sat paralyzed, waiting for direction from a duke who'd just watched his greatest vulnerability get weaponized against him in front of witnesses who would carry the story across the entire kingdom. Get out, Kadric said quietly. They scattered like prey fleeing a predator, leaving him alone in the strategy chamber surrounded by maps of territories he controlled and evidence that control meant nothing when someone understood exactly which pressure points would make power collapse. Kadric crossed to the window, pressing his forehead against cold glass, feeling rain vibrate through stone walls that had protected House Vaymont for generations. He'd spent his entire life building defenses against attachment, because attachment was leverage, and leverage got people killed. But he'd failed. Seraphine had gotten inside his walls, carved out space in the parts of himself he'd thought were dead, and now Evelyn was using that connection to destroy him with the precision of someone who'd studied his weaknesses for 7 years and finally found the one that mattered. Love wasn't strength. It was the most efficient weapon ever designed for turning powerful men into desperate fools. And Kadric had just learned that lesson in the most devastating way possible. The search lasted 18 hours and found nothing. No trail, no witnesses. No evidence of where Evelyn had taken Seraphine except reports of armed riders heading east toward the mountain passes before disappearing into terrain too rough for conventional pursuit. Kaedric stood in the courtyard watching dawn break over Raventhorn, exhaustion pressing down on him like stone, rage burning so hot beneath his skin that he felt like his entire body was on fire. Around him, soldiers moved with the grim efficiency of people who understood their duke was about to make decisions that would define the next decade of northern politics. And those decisions would be written in blood. Captain Torvin approached, his uniform soaked from rain that hadn't stopped since the attack, his expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news to a superior who might shoot the messenger. Your Grace, we've interrogated everyone who had contact with Lady Morcant in the past month. 3 servants confessed to passing information about security rotations. 2 guards admitted to accepting bribes in exchange for looking the other way during specific patrol windows. All of them are in the dungeons awaiting your judgment. Execute them, Kaedric said. Public display. Make sure everyone in this keep understands that betrayal costs everything. Sir, 2 of them have families. Then their families learn what happens when someone they love chooses treason. Torvin's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy or might have been horror. He nodded and left to carry out orders that would leave children orphaned and wives widowed because security had failed and someone needed to pay the price. Kaedric remained in the courtyard, staring at the eastern mountains where Seraphine was being held somewhere beyond his reach, beyond his protection, beyond his ability to control what happened next. For the first time in his adult life, he felt completely powerless. And powerlessness was worse than any wound, any betrayal, any defeat he'd ever experienced because it meant admitting that all the strength he'd accumulated, all the fear he'd generated, all the control he'd maintained, none of it mattered when someone he cared about was in danger, and he had no way to save them. Your Grace. The voice came from behind, soft and uncertain. Kaedric turned. A young servant stood in the rain, maybe 16 years old, soaked and shaking from cold or fear, or both. She held a sealed letter in her trembling hands. This was delivered to the eastern gate an hour ago, she said. The messenger wouldn't identify himself, just said to give it to you immediately. Kaedric took the letter. The seal was Evelyn's, a black rose pressed into crimson wax. He broke it open and read 3 lines written in handwriting he recognized. If you want her back alive, come to the abandoned monastery in the Grey Vale, alone, before midnight. Bring soldiers, and she dies. Bring weapons, and she dies. Come late, and she dies. Come exactly as instructed, and maybe, just maybe, we can negotiate terms that don't end with everyone you care about bleeding out in the snow. The letter wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Kaedric read it twice, memorizing every word, understanding with absolute clarity that this was the trap he'd known was coming. Evelyn was using Seraphine as bait to lure him into an impossible situation where any choice he made would result in catastrophic consequences. Go alone and unarmed, and he'd be vulnerable to ambush, assassination, capture. Bring support, and Seraphine would die before he reached her. Refuse to go, and he'd be condemning her to whatever Evelyn had planned, which would almost certainly be worse than a quick death. No good options, just variations of loss. He folded the letter and slipped it inside his coat, feeling the paper press against his chest like a weight he couldn't remove. Tell the stables to prepare my horse, Kaedric said. The servant stared at him. Your Grace, you can't possibly be considering... I'm not considering anything. I'm going. Now leave before I decide you've heard too much to be useful alive. She ran. Kaedric walked toward the stables, ignoring the rain, ignoring the exhaustion, ignoring the voice in his head that sounded disturbingly like Seraphine telling him that walking into obvious traps was how powerful men got themselves killed. But that voice didn't understand something fundamental. Power meant nothing if he couldn't protect the one person who'd made that power feel like something other than a burden he carried alone. And if rescuing her meant walking into a trap that would destroy him, then he'd walk into it with his eyes open and accept whatever came next. Because the alternative, living with the knowledge that he'd chosen survival over saving her, was worse than any death Evelyn could design. The Grey Vale Monastery rose against the twilight sky like a skeleton trying to prey. Kaedric rode through ruins that had been abandoned for decades, stone walls crumbling under the weight of weather and time, empty windows staring like eye sockets in a skull that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. Snow covered everything in shades of white and gray, muffling sound until the only noise was his horse's breathing and the wind cutting through broken architecture with the sound of something dying slowly. He'd left Raventhorn 6 hours ago, ridden through mountain passes that wanted to kill him, navigated terrain so rough that twice his horse nearly broke a leg on ice-covered rocks. No weapons except the knife hidden in his boot. No armor except the clothes he wore. Alone, exactly as Evelyn had demanded. The monastery courtyard opened before him, enclosed by walls that had once kept the world out, and now just kept secrets in. In the center, near a fountain that had stopped flowing before Keedric was born, Evelyn stood waiting. She wore black, her hair pulled back, her expression carved from something colder than the snow beneath their feet. Behind her, partially obscured by shadows, Seraphine knelt with her hands bound behind her back, a gag across her mouth, blood dried on her neck from where Evelyn's blade had cut her during the assault. Alive. Injured. Terrified but still conscious. Keedric dismounted, his boots crunching in snow. He walked forward slowly, hands visible, movements controlled to show he wasn't carrying obvious weapons. "I'm here," he said, as requested. Alone. Unarmed. "Now let her go." Evelyn smiled, and it was the saddest expression Keedric had ever seen. Pure grief transformed into something sharp enough to cut souls. "Do you have any idea how long I've waited for this moment?" she asked. 7 years of watching you build walls around yourself. 7 years of believing that if I just stayed close enough, patient enough, useful enough, you'd eventually see me as something other than a strategic asset. And now, here we are. You, finally vulnerable. Me, finally holding the leverage that matters. This isn't leverage. This is cruelty. No. Cruelty is spending 7 years beside someone who treats love like a weakness and intimacy like a threat. Cruelty is watching that same person choose a stranger over you after 3 weeks because she had the audacity to challenge him instead of the wisdom to support him. Seraphine didn't challenge me. She saw me. There's a difference. "Oh, I see you, Cassian. I've always seen you. The problem is you only value people who make you uncomfortable because you've convinced yourself that comfort equals complacency, and complacency gets people killed. So you push away anyone who actually cares about you and gravitate toward people who disrupt your control because disruption feels like honesty. Maybe. But at least disruption is real. Your version of caring felt like ownership, because I earned the right to ownership. 7 years of protecting your interests, managing your alliances, playing the games you refused to acknowledge needed playing. 7 years of being exactly what you needed even when you didn't have the emotional capacity to appreciate it. I never asked you to sacrifice yourself for my benefit. You didn't have to ask. I volunteered. Because that's what love looks like when it's given to someone incapable of recognizing it. The words hung in this frozen air between them. Behind Evelyn, Seraphine's eyes tracked the conversation, wide and focused, calculating something Keedric couldn't immediately identify. "What do you want, Evelyn? Name your price." "I want you to choose," she said simply. "Me or her. Right here, right now. Choose me, and we rebuild what you destroyed. Choose her, and I kill her in front of you and then disappear into the eastern provinces where you'll never find me. Either way, you live with the consequences of your decision for the rest of your life. That's not a choice. That's just sadism pretending to be justice. Call it whatever you want. The result is the same." Evelyn drew her blade, the steel catching twilight in shades of silver and red. She moved behind Seraphine, pressing the edge against her throat exactly where she'd cut before, opening the wound just enough that fresh blood began flowing. 10 seconds, Cassian. Choose. Keedric's mind raced through scenarios, searching for the angle, the leverage, the way out of an impossible situation. But there was no angle, no leverage. Just the brutal simplicity of a woman who'd decided that if she couldn't have him, nobody would, and if that meant destroying the one thing he cared about, then she'd do it with the precision of someone who'd spent 7 years learning exactly where to cut. 5 seconds. "I choose her," Keedric said. Evelyn's expression fractured, rage and grief and disappointment colliding into something so raw it looked like pain made visible. "Then watch her die knowing you could have saved her." The blade began to press deeper, and Seraphine moved. Her bound hands suddenly weren't bound anymore, the rope falling away like she'd been working the knots loose for hours. She drove her elbow backward into Evelyn's ribs, grabbed the blade arm, twisted with enough force to break the grip, and rolled away from the weapon before Evelyn could recover. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Evelyn staggered, shock replacing rage, staring at Seraphine like she'd just watched physics reverse itself. Kaedric was already moving, closing the distance, his boot knife clearing its sheath. He tackled Evelyn before she could pursue Seraphine, driving her into the snow, blade aimed at her throat. But Evelyn was faster than he expected, trained better than he'd assumed. She rolled with the impact, her leg hooking behind his knee, using his momentum to reverse their positions. Suddenly she was on top, her hands around his throat, squeezing with strength born from absolute rage. 7 years, she hissed. 7 years I wasted on you. Kaedric grabbed her wrists, trying to break the grip, feeling his vision start to tunnel from lack of oxygen. Behind Evelyn, he saw Seraphine searching for a weapon, finding a broken piece of masonry, raising it above her head. "Evelyn, stop," Seraphine said, her voice steady despite the blood on her neck. "This doesn't end the way you think it does." "Yes, it does. With him dead and you learning what it feels like to watch someone you love destroyed while you stand there helpless." She squeezed harder. Kaedric felt consciousness slipping, felt his body starting to shut down from oxygen deprivation, felt the edges of his vision go black. Then Seraphine brought the stone down on the back of Evelyn's skull. The impact sounded like something breaking inside a sealed room. Evelyn's grip went slack. She collapsed forward, blood pooling in the snow beneath her head, breathing shallow and irregular. Kaedric gasped air back into his lungs, shoving Evelyn's unconscious body aside, rolling onto his hands and knees. Seraphine dropped the stone and moved beside him, her hands finding his face, checking for injuries with the focused intensity of someone who'd just committed violence to prevent worse violence. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No." "You?" "Nothing permanent." They stared at each other, both covered in blood and snow, both shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion and the realization that they'd just survived something designed specifically to destroy them. "You freed yourself," Kaedric managed. "I've been working the knot since they dragged me from Raventhorn. Took 18 hours. But I knew if I could just get loose at the right moment, I could create an opening. You waited until I chose you. I needed to know if you would. And if I hadn't, then I would have freed myself anyway, and we'd be having a very different conversation right now about trust and priorities. Despite everything, the blood, the exhaustion, the woman bleeding in the snow between them, Kaedric almost laughed. Seraphine stood, helping him to his feet. Behind them, Evelyn remained unconscious, her breathing irregular, blood staining the snow in patterns that looked like something trying to escape its own shadow. "Is she alive?" Seraphine asked. Kaedric checked for a pulse. "Yes." "Barely." "What do we do with her?" The question hung between them, carrying weight that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with the fundamental choice that would define who Kaedric was beyond his reputation as the ruthless duke who ruled through fear. Killer, and he confirmed everything Evelyn had accused him of, being too damaged to value human life beyond strategic necessity. Spare her, and he risked her returning to finish what she'd started, attacking when he least expected it, using his mercy as proof of the weakness she'd always claimed he was too proud to acknowledge. No good options, just variations of compromise that would define whether he was capable of being something other than the monster everyone believed him to be. "We take her back to Raventhorn," Kaedric said finally. "She faces trial for assault, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. Let the law handle her instead of my rage. That's not justice. That's just delayed revenge." "Maybe. But it's the best I can offer right now." Seraphine studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. Together they lifted Evelyn's unconscious body, secured her across Kaedric's horse, and began the long ride back to Raventhorn through snow that had started falling again, covering their tracks, erasing evidence of violence from a landscape that had witnessed centuries of worse and would witness centuries more. And as they rode through darkness broken only by moonlight reflecting off ice, Kaedric realized something fundamental had changed inside him. He'd spent his entire life believing that caring about people made him weak. But watching Seraphine free herself, seeing her fight beside him instead of waiting to be rescued, understanding that she'd survived 18 hours of captivity by staying focused instead of surrendering to fear, all of it proved something he'd never considered. Caring about someone strong enough to save themselves didn't create weakness. It created the kind of partnership that made survival feel like something other than just prolonged suffering. And that realization terrified him more than any blade ever had, because it meant admitting that the walls he'd built to protect himself had actually been prison cells he'd mistaken for fortresses. and escaping them would require becoming someone completely different from the ruthless duke who'd ruled through fear for so long that fear had become his identity. The question was whether he was capable of that transformation, or whether he'd destroy Seraphine trying. The royal decree hung in the air between them like a death sentence written in official language. Kedrick stared at the messenger, then at the 50 armed soldiers wearing crown colors, then at Commander Thorn standing among the traitors with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and resolute. Behind him, Seraphine's breathing had gone shallow and rapid, the sound of someone calculating impossible odds and arriving at the same conclusion he'd already reached. They were surrounded, outnumbered, exhausted from 18 hours of rescue and violence, and now facing charges that would end with execution if he surrendered or siege if he resisted. No good options, just variations of death. The messenger stepped forward, unrolling the parchment with practiced ceremony that felt obscene given the circumstances. His voice carried across the courtyard with the hollow authority of someone reading words he didn't write and wouldn't have to enforce personally. Duke Cassian Vaymont, by order of His Majesty King Aldrich III, you are charged with the following crimes against the Crown and Kingdom of Valadorn: unauthorized expansion of military forces beyond treaty limitations, dissolution of noble contracts without royal approval, execution of Lord Harwick Vale without proper trial, conspiracy to establish independent rule over northern territories, and most gravely, assault upon a royal envoy during the Crimson Parliament. How do you answer these charges? Kedrick felt laughter building in his chest, the kind that came from exhaustion and rage mixing into something close to hysteria. The charges were technically accurate but strategically meaningless, manufactured justifications for what everyone in this courtyard already understood was a coordinated power grab by nobles who had decided the Duke had become too dangerous to tolerate and too isolated to defend. The real crime wasn't anything listed on that parchment. The real crime was being powerful enough to threaten the existing order while being stupid enough to show vulnerability at exactly the wrong moment. I answer that your charges are legitimate and irrelevant, Kedrick said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd stopped pretending politics was anything except violence wearing prettier clothes. The Crown wants my territories. The nobles want my resources. And you're all using legal language to justify theft, because calling it what it actually is would require honesty. Nobody in this kingdom possesses anymore. The messenger's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy. Your Grace, I'm authorized to offer terms. Surrender peacefully, submit to royal custody, and your life will be spared. Resist, and the Crown will take Raventhorn by force and execute everyone inside these walls for treason. Behind the messenger, Commander Thorn shifted uncomfortably. Your Grace, the commander said quietly, please, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Kedrick looked at the man who'd served House Vaymont for 12 years, who'd trained his soldiers, planned his defenses, shared strategy sessions that lasted deep into nights when neither of them could sleep. Betrayal always hurt worse when it came from people you'd trusted enough to stop watching closely. How long, Aldrich? The commander's jaw tightened. 6 months, since the engagement announcement. The Crown approached me with concerns about your stability, about your increasing isolation from noble alliances, about decisions that suggested you were prioritizing personal desires over strategic necessity. So they bought you. They offered protection for my family when your reign inevitably collapsed. I chose survival over loyalty. The same calculation you've made 1,000 times, not with people who trusted me. Then maybe you should have built trust that went deeper than strategic convenience. The words cut because they were true. Kedrick had spent years maintaining relationships through fear and necessity, never investing enough emotional currency to create loyalty that survived better offers. He'd treated people like chess pieces, useful until they weren't, disposable when circumstances required disposal. And now those chess pieces had decided to remove him from the board before he could sacrifice them. Seraphine moved beside him, her hand finding his, her grip tight enough to hurt. Her voice was low, meant only for him. How many loyal soldiers do we have inside the keep? Maybe 50. Against 300 if the Crown commits its full force. Can we hold? Not for long, days at most. Maybe a week if we're willing to sacrifice everyone who stays. Then we need a different strategy. There is no different strategy. We're cornered, outnumbered. And everyone I've spent years terrifying has finally decided that my fear is worth less than the crown's promises. She turned to face him directly, ignoring the soldiers, ignoring the messenger, ignoring the reality of their situation long enough to force him to meet her eyes. You've spent your entire life ruling through fear because you believed that fear was the only language power understood, she said quietly. But you were wrong. Fear is what keeps people obedient when they don't have better options. The moment someone offers them a way out, fear becomes worthless. What you needed was something stronger than fear, something that made people choose to stand with you even when standing against you was safer. And what's that? Worth. You needed to be worth the risk. The simplicity of it hit him harder than any blade. She was right. He'd built an empire on intimidation and strategic necessity, never offering people a reason to stay beyond avoiding the consequences of leaving. The moment the crown provided an alternative that felt safer than his protection, everyone had calculated the odds and chosen differently. He'd made himself powerful, but he'd never made himself valuable beyond that power, and now power alone wasn't enough. Your Grace, the messenger said, I need your answer. Will you surrender peacefully, or must this end in blood? Keodric looked across the courtyard at the assembled forces, soldiers who'd followed crown orders without question, nobles who'd chosen preservation over principle, Commander Thorn standing among traitors wearing the expression of someone who'd already made peace with his decisions. Then he looked at Seraphine, blood-stained and exhausted, still gripping his hand with enough force to ground him in the reality that whatever choice he made would determine whether she lived or died alongside him. He'd spent his entire adult life making impossible decisions, choosing who lived and died during famines, deciding which villages received protection and which got abandoned to raiders, calculating the cost of survival and paying it without hesitation, because hesitation got people killed faster than cruelty ever did. But this decision was different. This decision wasn't about territories or trade routes or strategic positioning. This decision was about whether he valued his own survival more than proving that everything Seraphine had said about him choosing fear over worth was wrong. Tell the crown. I reject their terms, Keodric said, his voice steady despite the chaos this would unleash. Tell them that if they want Raventhorn, they'll have to take it by force. And tell them that every soldier who dies trying will be a reminder that some things are worth defending even when defense is impossible. The messenger's face went pale. Your Grace, that's suicide. Probably, but it's honest suicide, which is more than I can say for whatever comfortable compromise you're offering. Behind the messenger, nobles exchanged glances that meant they'd expected resistance but hoped for surrender. The soldiers raised weapons, crossbows and swords catching dawn light in ways that made the courtyard look like it was already painted in blood. Commander Thorn stepped forward, his expression pained. Cassian, please. I've known you for 12 years. Don't make me kill you. You won't kill me, Aldrich. You'll watch while someone else does it. Then tell yourself you were just following orders. That's always been the difference between us. I own my violence. You just rent it. The commander's hand moved to his sword, fingers wrapping around the hilt. Your Grace. Get off my land, Keodric interrupted. All of you. Tell the crown that Raventhorn Keep is closed to royal authority until further notice. Anyone who attempts entry will be treated as an invading force and responded to accordingly. You're declaring war on the kingdom? I'm declaring independence from a kingdom that's proven it values compliance over justice. There's a difference. The courtyard went absolutely silent, the kind of silence that happened when someone said something so catastrophically reckless that everyone needed a moment to process whether they'd heard correctly. Keodric had just committed treason in front of 50 witnesses, had just transformed a legal dispute into an act of rebellion, had just guaranteed that whatever happened next would be written in enough blood to drown generations. And the worst part, the absolutely worst part, was that he meant it. He was done compromising, done calculating, done pretending that survival through submission was the same as actually living. Better to die fighting for something that mattered than live another decade, maintaining power through fear that would evaporate the moment someone offered his people a better deal. The messenger backed away slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of nervous surrender. I'll convey your message to His Majesty. But understand that you've just condemned everyone in this keep to execution for treason. Then they'll die knowing they stood for something. That's more than most people get. The crown forces retreated, moving toward the outer gates with weapons still raised, expecting ambush or sudden violence. But Keodric remained motionless, watching them leave, feeling the weight of his decision settle into his bones like lead. Beside him, Seraphine's grip on his hand loosened slightly. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. I haven't decided which yet. Probably both. What happens now? Now we prepare for siege. And we hope that somewhere in the northern territories, there are enough people who remember that I kept them alive during famines to decide that maybe standing with me is worth the risk. And if there aren't, then we die together. Which is still better than watching you get executed because I chose survival over principle. She studied his face, searching for something. Regret. Second thoughts. The rational calculation that had defined his entire approach to power. But Kaedric had nothing left to give except exhausted honesty. You've changed, she said quietly. Good. The person I was before would have gotten us both killed through different methods. At least this way we control how the story ends. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. Comfort is for people who have time to appreciate it. He turned toward the keep, still holding her hand, feeling dawn light wash across stone walls that had protected House Vaymont for 8 generations. Behind those walls waited maybe 50 soldiers loyal enough or trapped enough to stay. Inside the dungeons, Evelyn remained unconscious from Seraphine's blow, her fate undecided. In the strategy chambers, maps documented territories he'd just declared independent from a kingdom powerful enough to crush him if they committed full resources. Impossible odds. Certain death. And for the first time in years, Kaedric felt something other than the exhausting weight of maintaining control. He felt alive. The War Council convened within the hour. 53 soldiers stood in the throne hall, everyone who'd chosen to stay when the crown forces retreated. Some loyal, some trapped, some simply too exhausted to process that their duke had just committed treason and dragged them into rebellion whether they wanted it or not. Kaedric stood before them without armor, without ceremony, without the careful performance he usually maintained when addressing troops. Just exhaustion and honesty and the brutal reality that they were about to face overwhelming force with insufficient resources. You all know what just happened in the courtyard, he began. The crown has charged me with treason. I've rejected their authority. And that means everyone in this room is now technically a traitor to the kingdom of Valadorn. So if anyone wants to leave before this becomes official, now is the time. No judgment, no consequences. Just walk out those doors and whatever happens next isn't your responsibility. Nobody moved. Kaedric waited, giving them time to process, to calculate, to recognize that staying meant accepting death as the most likely outcome. Still, nobody left. Good, he continued, because I'm not going to lie to you about our chances. The crown can field 300 soldiers immediately, maybe 800 if they commit their full northern garrison. We have 53. They have siege equipment, supply lines, and royal authority that will bring nobles rushing to support them. We have stone walls and maybe a week's worth of food if we ration carefully. So why stay? A voice called from the back. Sergeant Kael, a veteran who'd served House Vaymont for 15 years. If we're going to die anyway, why not surrender and take our chances with royal mercy? Because royal mercy means execution after a trial designed to look fair, Kaedric said. And I'd rather die fighting for something I chose than live knowing I submitted to people who use legal language to justify theft. That's pride talking, not strategy. You're right. It is pride. But pride is the only thing I have left that the crown can't take through force or legislation, so I'm using it. Murmurs spread through the assembled soldiers, conversations happening in lowered voices, doubt mixing with exhaustion, mixing with the strange kind of loyalty that came from following someone stupid enough to declare war against impossible odds. Seraphine stepped forward, moving beside Kaedric. Her dress was still stained with blood from the monastery, her neck bandaged where Evelyn's blade had cut her, but her voice carried absolute certainty. I know most of you don't trust me, she said. I've been at Raventhorn for 3 weeks. I have no military experience, no noble connections worth mentioning, no reason to be standing here except that your duke chose me. But I'm asking you to stay anyway. Not because we'll win, not because survival is guaranteed, but because what happens here will determine whether this kingdom continues rewarding nobles who accumulate power through fear, or whether someone finally proves that rulers can be held accountable when they stop serving the people they're supposed to protect. The hall went quiet, soldiers processing words from a woman they barely knew, a woman who had no authority except whatever they chose to grant her. Commander Thorn betrayed you because the crown offered him safety, Seraphine continued. Lord Vale tried to assassinate Duke Vaymont because consolidating power seemed easier than accepting oversight. Lady Evelyn coordinated a kidnapping because she felt entitled to his affection. Every single threat you've faced came from people who believed their comfort mattered more than justice. So yes, we're probably going to die. But we'll die proving that some people still choose principle over preservation. She stopped talking. The silence stretched. Then Sergeant Kael stepped forward. I'll stay. Not because I believe we'll win, but because I've spent 15 years watching the Duke make impossible decisions to keep villages alive during famines while nobles got rich hoarding grain. If he's finally choosing to fight the system instead of managing it, I want to see how that ends. Another soldier stepped forward, then another, then 5 more. Within minutes, the entire room had committed to staying, transformed from uncertain troops into something resembling actual rebellion. Kedrick felt something crack in his chest, not weakness, but the recognition that he'd spent years believing people only followed him through fear, when really they'd been waiting for permission to believe his power served something beyond his own survival. All right, he said, then here's what we do. We fortify the keep, we ration supplies. We send riders to every village in the Northern Territories with a message explaining that the Crown is attempting to seize Raventhorn and asking whether anyone remembers that House Vaymont kept them alive when the capital forgot they existed. You think the villagers will help? Sergeant Kael asked. They're peasants. They don't have weapons or training. They have numbers and memory. And if even a fraction of them decide that defending Raventhorn is worth the risk, we might survive long enough to make the Crown reconsider whether this siege is worth the cost. That's not strategy. That's desperation. Desperation is just strategy without better options. Make it happen. The soldiers scattered, moving to defensive positions, organizing supplies, preparing for a siege that would define whether House Vaymont survived or became a cautionary tale about what happened when rulers chose pride over submission. Seraphine remained beside him, her presence steady in the chaos. You just gambled everything on villagers you've never met deciding to risk their lives for you, she said quietly. I gambled everything on people remembering that I'm not perfect, but I kept my word when keeping it cost me more than breaking it would have. That's all I have left. What if they don't come? Then we die. But at least we die knowing we asked instead of assuming they owed us nothing. She took his hand again, her fingers lacing through his with gentle pressure. I'm proud of you. Don't be. Pride requires success. All I've done is commit treason and drag 53 people into probable death. No. You've done something harder. You've admitted that power without worth is just violence waiting to be replaced by better violence. And that admission might cost you everything, but it's honest. Which is more than most rulers ever manage. Kedrick pulled her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, steady and real and alive in a way that made everything else feel temporary. He'd spent his entire life believing that caring about people made him weak, that attachment was leverage, that love was just another weapon the world could use to destroy him. But standing there with Seraphine in his arms, while 53 soldiers prepared for impossible odds, Kedrick realized something fundamental. Weakness wasn't caring about people. Weakness was being too afraid to care because caring required vulnerability, and vulnerability meant accepting that. Control was always an illusion. People told themselves to avoid confronting how little they actually controlled. Real strength wasn't maintaining power through fear. Real strength was admitting that power meant nothing if you didn't use it to protect something worth protecting. And Seraphine was worth protecting, even if protection meant dying beside her when the Crown forces returned. The riders went out at noon carrying messages written in Kedrick's own handwriting to the villages of the Northern Territories. The Crown has charged me with treason for expanding military protection beyond treaty limitations, for executing a noble who conspired to let your children die from curable diseases, and for refusing to submit to authority that abandoned you during famines. If you remember that House Vaymont kept you alive when the capital forgot you existed, I'm asking you to stand with me now, not as subjects, not as property, but as people who deserve rulers held accountable when they stop serving your interests. Come to Raventhorn if you believe that justice matters more than noble privilege. Stay home if you believe submission is safer than resistance. Either way, know that I chose to fight because some things are worth dying for. And you're one of them. The message was reckless, inflammatory, and guaranteed to either save them or accelerate their destruction depending on whether the villagers remembered gratitude or fear more clearly. Kedrick watched the riders disappear into winter landscape. 12 men on horseback carrying words that would determine whether rebellion died in days or somehow managed to survive long enough to become actual resistance. Beside him on the battlements, Seraphine stood wrapped in a borrowed cloak, her eyes tracking the horizon where crown forces would appear eventually. "How long before they attack?" she asked. 2 days if they're cautious. Tomorrow if they're confident. Tonight if they're stupid. Which do you think they'll be? Confident. The crown has 800 soldiers within marching distance and a kingdom full of nobles eager to prove their loyalty by crushing rebellion. They'll take their time, build siege equipment, make a spectacle of it, turn my execution into theater that reminds everyone what happens when rulers forget their place. That gives us time to prepare, time to delay the inevitable. There's a difference. She turned to face him, her expression sharp with the kind of determination he'd learned to recognize as dangerous. "Stop talking like we've already lost. We haven't lost until we're dead. Everything before that is just strategy. Strategy requires resources we don't have. Strategy requires imagination, which you've spent years suppressing because imagination feels like weakness in a world that rewards ruthlessness. But you're not just ruthless anymore. You've changed. So use that change to think differently about what's possible." Kedrick stared at her, seeing conviction in her eyes that had no rational basis in reality. They were surrounded, outnumbered, facing forces that would crush them if they committed even half their available troops. Imagination didn't change mathematics. Hope didn't alter logistics. But hope did something more dangerous than either. Hope made people fight longer than rational calculations said they should, and fighting longer meant more time for impossible things to become slightly less impossible. "What do you suggest?" he asked. "I suggest we stop thinking like a besieged fortress and start thinking like people with nothing left to lose. The crown expects you to hole up inside these walls and die slowly. So do the opposite. Take the fight to them before they're prepared. That's suicide. Only if we lose. If we win, it's called decisive action. We have 53 soldiers. They have 800. Then we don't fight 800 soldiers. We fight the supply lines, the leadership, the assumptions that make large armies feel invincible. We make them afraid of the dark. We make every step toward Raventhorn cost more than they're willing to pay. We turn their advantage into a liability by refusing to fight the war they're prepared for." Kedrick felt something shift in his understanding, not hope exactly, but the recognition that Seraphine was right. He'd spent years thinking like someone with everything to lose, making careful decisions designed to preserve what he'd built. But now he had nothing to preserve except lives and principles, and preserving those required thinking like someone with nothing to lose, which meant taking risks he'd spent his entire career avoiding. "All right," he said, "we try it your way. We raid their supply lines tonight, make them cautious, make them second-guess whether besieging Raventhorn is worth bleeding for. How many men? 10. Small enough to move fast, experienced enough to do damage." She smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression he'd seen outside of Evelyn's final moments. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. I wasn't asking permission." "Seraphine, you have no military training. I survived 18 hours of captivity by staying focused instead of panicking. I freed myself from restraints while planning exactly when to move for maximum impact. And I killed a woman with a piece of masonry to save your life. So don't tell me I'm not capable of handling violence." She was right, and Kedrick felt pride mixing with terror at the realization that the woman he'd chosen was brave enough and reckless enough to follow him into suicide missions because she believed partnership meant sharing risk instead of accepting protection. "Fine," he said, "but you follow my orders. No improvisation. No heroics. We go in, we destroy their supplies, we get out. Understood?" Understood. They spent the afternoon preparing, selecting soldiers, gathering weapons, planning approach routes through terrain rough enough to avoid patrols. By sunset, everything was ready. 10 soldiers, including Kedrick and Seraphine, dressed in black, armed with blades and fire, moving through the eastern gate under cover of darkness. Behind them, Raventhorn Keep rose against the night sky like a fortress built from stubbornness and stone. Ahead, somewhere in the winter landscape, Crown forces were establishing camp and preparing siege equipment, confident that crushing rebellion would be straightforward and final. They had no idea what was coming, and that ignorance was about to cost them everything. Batin. The Crown's supply depot sat 3 miles east of Raventhorn in a valley protected by natural ridgelines. Kedrick led his team through frozen terrain, moving with the practiced silence of people who'd learned that noise got you killed faster than bullets. Behind him, 9 soldiers followed in single file, their breathing controlled, their movements economical. Seraphine moved near the middle of the formation, her footsteps careful, her focus absolute. Above them, clouds covered the moon, turning the landscape into shades of black and darker black. Perfect conditions for violence that needed to remain invisible until too late. They reached the ridgeline overlooking the depot 90 minutes after leaving Raventhorn. Below, torches illuminated rows of supply wagons, food, weapons, medical supplies, everything an army needed to sustain a siege. Guards patrolled in pairs, maybe 20 soldiers total, rotating every 2 hours with the mechanical precision of people who'd done this duty 1,000 times, and stopped considering that routine could be fatal. Kedrick studied the layout, counting guards, measuring distances, calculating approach vectors. Beside him, Sergeant Kyle waited with the patient silence of someone who understood that good commanders thought before acting. 8 guards on the perimeter, Kedrick whispered. Another 6 near the supply wagons. 4 more around the command tent. We go in 2 teams. First team takes out the perimeter guards silently. Second team sets fires and retreats before reinforcements arrive. What about prisoners? Kyle asked. No prisoners. We're not here for intelligence. We're here to make them afraid. He divided the team, sending Kyle and 4 soldiers to handle the perimeter while he led Seraphine and 3 others toward the supply wagons. They moved down the ridgeline like shadows bleeding into darkness, covering ground with practiced efficiency that made sound feel impossible. The first guard died without noise, Sergeant Kyle's blade entering through the base of his skull with surgical precision. The second guard turned at the wrong moment, saw movement, opened his mouth to shout warning before a crossbow bolt punched through his throat. 2 down, 18 remaining. Kedrick's team reached the supply wagons, moving between rows of cargo while guards patrolled obliviously nearby. Seraphine carried oil and rags, her hands steady despite the fact that this was her first actual combat operation. She soaked fabric, wrapped it around arrow shafts, waited for signal. Kedrick checked positions. Guards were distributed poorly, clustered near the command tent, leaving the supplies exposed. Amateur mistake. They'd assumed rebels wouldn't be stupid enough to attack a fortified position. They'd assumed wrong. Now, Kedrick whispered. Fire arrows launched simultaneously from 4 positions, arcing through darkness before embedding in canvas and wood. Flames erupted, spreading faster than expected, consuming supplies with the hungry efficiency of fire that had been waiting for permission to burn. Shouts erupted from the command tent. Guards rushed toward the flames, abandoning positions, creating chaos that made defense impossible and retreat easy. Kedrick's team moved back toward the ridgeline, retracing their approach route, while behind them the depot transformed into an inferno, visible for miles. Supplies worth thousands of marks burned while soldiers scrambled to salvage what they could. Halfway up the ridgeline, Seraphine stumbled, her boot catching on ice-covered rock. She went down hard, her hand scraping against stone, drawing blood. Kedrick grabbed her arm, hauling her upright, scanning for pursuit. Below, guards were still focused on the fire, too distracted to notice shadows retreating into darkness. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine, just clumsy. Stay close." They reached the ridgeline summit where the rest of the team waited, breathing hard, adrenaline still pumping through systems that expected combat but got escape instead. "Everyone accounted for?" Kedrick asked. Sergeant Kale nodded. "All present, no casualties, supply depot is burning. Estimate 70% loss on their food and medical supplies." "Good. Let's move before they organize pursuit." They moved through frozen landscape, putting distance between themselves and the burning depot, feeling the satisfaction of successful violence mixing with the knowledge that this was just the opening move in a war they were still overwhelmingly likely to lose. But for tonight, they'd proven something important. They'd proven that rebellion wasn't just dying slowly behind walls. It was fighting back when fighting back seemed impossible. And that proof might be enough to make the Crown reconsider whether crushing Raventhorn was worth the cost they were suddenly being asked to pay. They reached Raventhorn 3 hours before dawn, exhausted and covered in smoke. The eastern gate opened immediately, guards hauling back iron bars with practiced efficiency. Inside the courtyard, soldiers waited with expressions mixing relief with respect. Word had already spread that the Duke had personally led a raid on Crown supply lines and returned alive. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Kaedric dismounted, his body aching from exertion, his mind already calculating next moves. Beside him, Seraphine slid from her horse with grace that belied her exhaustion, her bandaged hand pressed against her chest. "Get her to the medical wing," Kaedric told a nearby guard. "Make sure the wound is clean." "I'm fine," Seraphine protested. "You're bleeding." "That's not fine. It's a scratch. So was the blade wound in my ribs. Get it treated before infection makes it worse." She studied his face, reading concern beneath command, then nodded and followed the guard toward the medical chambers. Kaedric watched her disappear into the keep, feeling something tight in his chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. She'd followed him into combat without hesitation, moved through enemy territory with competence that suggested natural talent, set fires that destroyed strategic resources, and stumbled on ice like a normal person instead of the invincible warrior he sometimes forgot she wasn't. She was brave and reckless and completely unprepared for the war they were fighting. And he was terrified of losing her to violence he'd chosen to embrace instead of avoid. "Your Grace." Captain Torvin approached from the direction of the dungeons, his expression grim. "We have a situation." "What kind of situation?" "Lady Evelyn woke up an hour ago. She's demanding to speak with you. Says she has information about the Crown's plans that might change your strategy." Kaedric felt exhaustion press down harder. Evelyn, the woman who'd orchestrated his destruction, kidnapped Seraphine, tried to force impossible choices through violence, now claiming she had information that could help. Either a trap or desperation, both equally dangerous. "What does she want in exchange?" Kaedric asked. "She didn't say. Just demanded to speak with you personally. Tell her I'll consider it after I've slept. And double the guards on her cell. If she's conscious, she's dangerous." "Yes, Your Grace." Torvin left. Kaedric remained in the courtyard, staring at stone walls illuminated by torchlight, feeling the weight of decisions that kept accumulating without resolution. He'd declared independence from the Crown, had raided their supply lines, had gambled everything on villagers he'd never met deciding his life was worth risking theirs. And now Evelyn was offering information that might be strategic advantage or psychological warfare designed to destabilize him when he was most vulnerable. Too many variables. Too many threats, not enough resources to address any of them adequately. But dwelling on impossibility didn't change mathematics. It just wasted energy he needed for surviving the next 48 hours when Crown forces would arrive in overwhelming numbers and the real siege would begin. Kaedric climbed the stairs toward his chambers, his body screaming protest, his mind already racing ahead to supply calculations and defensive positions and the 100 small decisions that would determine whether anyone survived long enough to see whether rebellion succeeded or failed. He reached his chambers and found Seraphine waiting inside, her hand freshly bandaged, her expression carrying the residual tension of someone who'd just committed violence for the first time and was processing what that meant about who she was becoming. "You should be resting," he said. "So should you. But we're both too wired to sleep, so we might as well be wired together." She crossed the room, moving into his space with the easy familiarity of someone who'd decided that propriety mattered less than proximity. Kaedric wrapped his arms around her, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, steady and real and alive. "I was terrified tonight," she whispered. "Not during the raid. During was fine, but after, riding back, I kept thinking about all the ways it could have gone wrong, all the ways we could have died. And I realized I'm not actually brave. I'm just too stubborn to let fear stop me from doing things that need doing." That's the definition of bravery. No. Bravery is not being afraid. What I am is just terrified and refusing to let terror control my decisions. Then you're exactly what I need, because I've spent my entire life letting fear control my decisions by pretending I wasn't afraid. You're teaching me that admitting fear doesn't make you weak. It just makes you honest. She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "We're probably going to die in the next few days." "Probably. I'm not ready to die, neither am I. But I'm ready to fight for something worth dying for. And you're worth dying for." She kissed him, and it felt like desperation and hope compressed into a single moment of connection that acknowledged reality without surrendering to it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Seraphine rested her forehead against his. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. Promise me that if this goes badly, if the Crown breaks through and survival becomes impossible, You won't waste time trying to protect me. We fight together. We die together. No heroic sacrifices. No desperate last stands where you throw yourself in front of blades meant for me. I can't promise that. Yes, you can. Because partnership means trusting that I'm strong enough to face whatever comes, even if what comes is death. Kaedric held her gaze, seeing absolute certainty in her eyes, understanding that she meant every word. She wasn't asking for protection. She was demanding to be treated like an equal, even when equality meant sharing the worst possible outcomes. All right, he said. Together. No matter what. Together. They stood in the darkness of his chambers while outside Raventhorn Keep, dawn began breaking over the northern sea. Somewhere in the winter landscape, Crown forces were regrouping, planning their assault, preparing to crush rebellion with overwhelming force. And somewhere in the villages scattered across northern territories, people were reading messages from a duke who'd kept them alive during famines and asking themselves whether standing with him was worth the risk. The next 48 hours would answer that question, would determine whether rebellion died quietly behind stone walls or somehow transformed into something larger, something that proved rulers could be held accountable when they stopped serving the people who kept them in power. Kaedric didn't know which outcome was more likely, but standing there with Seraphine in his arms, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, he realized something fundamental. He'd spent his entire life believing that survival required control, that power meant maintaining distance, that caring about people made him weak. But he'd been wrong about everything. Survival required partnership. Power meant accepting accountability. And caring about someone strong enough to stand beside him was the only thing that made fighting worth the cost. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And together was enough. The smoke rose like accusations written in ash. Kaedric stood on the battlements watching 3 villages burn simultaneously, the flames visible even from Raventhorn's height, orange and red against gray winter sky. The rider who'd collapsed at his feet was being carried to the medical wing, leaving a trail of blood across stone that had witnessed 8 generations of Vaymont rule, but never this. Never the systematic. Destruction of civilians as a message about what happened when peasants considered backing rebellion against the crown. This wasn't war. This was extermination disguised as strategy. Beside him, Seraphine gripped the stone wall hard enough that her knuckles went white. How many people lived in those villages? 200 in the eastern settlement? Maybe 300 in the valley town, another 150 in the northern farmsteads. So 600 people are burning alive because you declared independence? 600 people are burning alive because the crown decided that terrorizing civilians was more efficient than actually fighting soldiers. Don't confuse cause with responsibility. But her words cut deeper than she probably intended because she was right. He'd made the decision to resist. He'd gambled that villages would support rebellion. And now those villages were paying the price for his calculations with their lives, their homes, everything they'd built over generations, reduced to smoke and screaming because he'd been stupid enough to believe that principles mattered more than survival. Your Grace? Captain Torvin approached from behind, his expression grim in the way that meant more bad news was coming. The scouts just returned from the northern ridge. Crown forces are establishing positions around all major population centers. They're not marching on Raventhorn. They're isolating us by destroying everything that might provide support. How many villages? At least 12. Maybe more. They're moving fast, burning everything, killing anyone who resists. And survivors? Being driven south toward the capital as refugees. The Crown is making sure that even if we somehow survive this siege, there won't be anything left in the northern territories worth ruling. Kaedric felt rage burning so hot in his chest that breathing hurt. The Crown wasn't just crushing rebellion. They were erasing the foundation of his power by destroying the people he'd spent years protecting. No villages meant no tax base, no food production, no population to govern. Even if he somehow won this war, he'd be ruling over ruins and mass graves. Perfect strategy. Absolutely devastating. And entirely his fault for not anticipating that the Crown would choose scorched earth over conventional siege. Mobilize every soldier we have, Kaedric said, his voice hollow. We're riding out to stop the massacres. Your Grace, Torvin said carefully, if we leave Raventhorn, we abandon our defensive position. The Crown forces will take the keep before we can return. Then they take it. I'm not sitting behind walls while civilians burn because I made a decision they're paying for. Sir, that's suicide. We have 53 soldiers. The Crown has scattered their forces across 12 locations. Even if we reach the villages in time, We can't defend them all. We defend as many as we can. And if that means dying in the attempt, then we die proving that some rulers actually mean it when they say they serve the people instead of using them. Seraphine grabbed his arm, her grip fierce enough to hurt. Cassian, listen to what you're saying. You're throwing away the only defensive advantage we have to save villages that might already be gone. That's not strategy. That's just guilt pretending to be heroism. It's accountability. I made a choice that endangered them. I don't get to hide behind stone walls while they burn for it. But dying doesn't save them. It just adds your corpse to the pile. Then what do you suggest? I sit here safe while 600 people who trusted me get slaughtered? Seraphine's eyes blazed with something between fury and desperation. I suggest you stop thinking like someone trying to redeem himself through martyrdom and start thinking like someone trying to actually win. The crown wants you emotional, wants you making reckless decisions that sacrifice your position for temporary moral satisfaction. So do the opposite. Be ruthless. Be calculating. Be the Duke who survived by making impossible choices and living with the consequences. The words hit like physical blows, cutting through rage to expose the uncomfortable truth underneath. She was right. The Crown had designed this situation specifically to force him into choosing between defending his position or saving civilians, knowing that either choice would destroy him. Stay and watch villages burn, proving he valued power over people. Leave and lose Raventhorn, proving he was too emotional to rule strategically. No good options, just variations of loss designed to break him regardless of which path he chose. But standing there on the battlements watching smoke rise from burning villages, Kedrick realized something that changed his entire understanding of the situation. He'd spent his entire life making choices based on what would preserve his power, and that approach had gotten 600 people burned alive. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe it was time to choose based on what was right instead of what was strategic, even if right meant certain death. Prepare the horses, Kedrick said quietly. We ride in 10 minutes. Anyone who wants to stay and defend Raventhorn can do so. Everyone else comes with me to stop the massacres. Your Grace? That's an order, Captain. Torvin stared at him for a long moment, reading something in Kedrick's expression that made the captain's protest die unspoken. Then he nodded and left to organize troops who were about to ride toward overwhelming odds for the sake of civilians they'd never met. Seraphine remained beside him, her hand still gripping his arm. You're really doing this. I'm really doing this. Even though it means losing everything? Especially because it means losing everything. I've spent my entire life accumulating power by making calculated decisions that prioritize preservation over principle. And what did it get me? A keep full of people who followed me through fear. A kingdom that turned against me the moment I showed vulnerability. And 600 civilians burning because I gambled their lives on a strategy that failed. So you're throwing away your life to prove a point? I'm throwing away my life to save the people I was supposed to protect. There's a difference. She studied his face, searching for something. Regret? Second thoughts? The rational calculation that had defined his approach to power. But Kedrick had nothing left to give except exhausted certainty. All right, she said finally, then I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. We've had this conversation before. It ended with me coming anyway. Save us both time and just accept that wherever you go, I go. Seraphine, this is suicide. Then we die together. You promised. She was right, he had promised. Together, no matter what. No heroic sacrifices. No desperate last stands where one person threw themselves in front of blades meant for the other. Partnership meant sharing the worst possible outcomes, even when those outcomes included riding towards certain death to save strangers. Together, Kedrick agreed, and for the first time since watching the villages burn, he felt something other than rage. He felt ready. They rode out through the eastern gate with 47 soldiers, leaving 6 behind to defend Raventhorn against forces that would overwhelm them within hours. The winter landscape stretched ahead in shades of white and gray, smoke rising from multiple directions, the sky dark with ash from burning villages. Kedrick led the formation, riding harder than was safe on ice-covered ground, feeling his horse's muscles strain beneath him. Behind him, Seraphine rode with the focus of someone who'd never trained for cavalry combat, but refused to let inexperience slow her down. Around them, soldiers moved in tight formation, weapons ready, expressions locked in the grim determination of people who understood they were riding toward death and had chosen to do it anyway. The first village appeared after 90 minutes of brutal riding. What remained of it? Buildings burned down to foundations. Bodies scattered across frozen ground, some still smoking from being caught inside collapsing structures. Crown soldiers moved through the ruins with systematic efficiency, searching for survivors to kill or capture. Maybe 30 soldiers total, against 47. Finally, odds that didn't feel impossible. Kedrick raised his hand, signaling halt. The formation stopped just below the ridgeline, hidden from the village by natural terrain. He surveyed the scene, counting enemies, measuring positions, calculating approach vectors with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years turning violence into mathematics. Sergeant Kael moved beside him. Your orders, Your Grace. We hit them fast. No mercy, no prisoners. Anyone wearing crown colors dies. Sir, some of those soldiers are just following orders. I don't care. They're burning civilians. That forfeits their right to mercy. He spurred his horse forward before Kael could respond, the animal launching over the ridgeline and down toward the burning village, with enough speed that the ground blurred beneath him. Behind him, 46 soldiers followed, their war cries cutting through winter air. The crown forces turned, shock registering on their faces, scrambling for weapons before the rebel charge crashed into them like a wave made of steel and rage. Kaedric's blade found the first soldier before the man could raise his crossbow, the edge cutting through neck and spine with force that nearly unseated Kaedric from his saddle. He recovered, wheeled his horse, drove his blade through another soldier's chest, while the man was still processing that he was under attack. Around him, the battle devolved into savage chaos. Sergeant Kael fought with the brutal efficiency of a veteran, his sword moving in patterns honed through decades of combat. Other soldiers crashed into Crown forces with enough violence to scatter formations, turning organized military operation into desperate survival. Seraphine stayed close to Kaedric's position, her stolen blade cutting with more luck than skill, her horse responding to panic with unpredictable movements that somehow kept her alive through moments that should have killed her. The fight lasted maybe 5 minutes. When it ended, 30. Crown soldiers lay dead or dying in the snow, while Kaedric's forces had lost 3 men to crossbow bolts and 1 to a blade through the gut. 4 dead, 30 killed, and 1 village saved from complete annihilation, though saved was generous for a settlement already burned to foundations with most of its population dead. Survivors emerged from hiding, maybe 20 people, mostly women and children, covered in ash and blood and the specific kind of trauma that came from watching your entire world burn while soldiers laughed. An old woman approached Kaedric, her face streaked with soot, her eyes carrying the empty expression of someone who'd stopped expecting rescue. Your Grace, you came. I came too late. You came. That's more than the crown did, more than anyone else would have. She knelt in the snow, her movements stiff from age and injury. Around her, other survivors did the same, kneeling before a duke who'd just committed treason to save them from systematic slaughter. Kaedric dismounted, his legs nearly giving out from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. He walked to the old woman and helped her stand, feeling her weight against him, fragile and real and alive. Don't kneel, he said quietly. Not to me. Not to anyone. You survived. That takes more strength than anything I've done. What happens now, Your Grace? Now you ride to Raventhorn. It's not safe, but it's safer than staying here. My soldiers will escort you. And you? I'm riding to the next village. And the next. And the next. Until there aren't any left to save or I'm dead trying. The old woman's expression cracked, grief flooding through the numbness. You're going to get yourself killed. Probably. But at least I'll die doing something that matters instead of hiding behind walls pretending survival is the same as living. He remounted, signaling his remaining soldiers to prepare for movement. Behind him, survivors were being organized, children lifted onto horses, wounded supported by the able-bodied. Seraphine rode beside him, her face pale, her stolen blade still gripped in white-knuckle hands. That was brutal. That was necessary. Is there a difference? Not anymore. They rode toward the next village and the next, moving through winter landscape that had become a graveyard, fighting the same desperate battle over and over, arrived too late to prevent massacres. Kill Crown soldiers with savage efficiency, save whoever remained alive, send them toward Raventhorn while riding toward the next burning settlement. 4 villages saved, 8 villages lost. 17 soldiers dead, hundreds of civilians rescued, thousands dead or driven south as refugees. and somewhere behind them, Crown forces were converging on Raventhorn, surrounding the keep, preparing the siege that would crush whatever remained of House Vaymont's resistance. But Cedric didn't care about the keep anymore. Didn't care about power or legacy, or the strategic position he was abandoning. He cared about the old woman who'd knelt in ash thanking him for showing up too late. He cared about the children being lifted onto horses, their eyes empty from witnessing horrors no child should survive. He cared about proving that rulers could be held accountable when they chose preservation over protecting the people who'd trusted them. And if that meant dying in a frozen field surrounded by enemies, then he'd die knowing he'd finally chosen right over strategic. That was enough. Stats. The final village appeared just before sunset on the second day. Larger than the others, maybe 400 people, situated in a valley that made defense possible if anyone had bothered to organize it. Crown forces were already inside the walls, moving through streets with systematic brutality, dragging civilians from homes, executing anyone who resisted. Cedric counted the enemy, maybe 60 soldiers, professional and organized, led by a commander whose colors suggested minor nobility with something to prove. Against his remaining 23 troops, impossible odds, certain death. He didn't hesitate. The charge came from multiple directions simultaneously, Cedric leading the main force through the eastern gate, while Sergeant Kael's team hit from the north. The Crown forces turned to face them, surprise giving way to disciplined response, formations tightening, weapons raising with practiced coordination. The battle was savage and immediate. Cedric's blade cut through the first rank, opening throats and severing limbs with the brutal efficiency of someone who'd stopped thinking of combat as anything except necessary slaughter. Around him, his soldiers fought with desperate courage, outnumbered and exhausted but unwilling to retreat while civilians were dying. Seraphine stayed close, her stolen blade moving with more confidence now, her horse responding to direction instead of panic. She killed a Crown soldier who'd been aiming a crossbow at Cedric's back, the blade punching through the man's ribs with enough force to stick. She couldn't pull it free. The soldier fell, taking her weapon with him. Another Crown soldier saw her disarmed, moved to capitalize, his sword raised for a killing strike. Cedric intercepted him, his blade meeting the enemy's with force that sent shocks up his arm. He drove forward, using weight and momentum to overpower technique, forcing the soldier back until he could drive his knife through the gap in the man's armor. The soldier went down. Cedric turned, searching for Seraphine. Finding her on the ground beside her fallen horse, blood running from a gash across her forehead, her eyes unfocused from impact. Time slowed. Everything slowed. The battle continued around them, but Cedric's entire focus narrowed to the woman lying in blood-stained snow, vulnerable and injured and about to die because he'd been stupid enough to let her follow him into suicide missions. He dismounted, moving to cover her position, his blade raised against the Crown soldiers converging on their location. 3 men, then 5, then 8. Too many. No way out. This was how it ended. Not in throne rooms or political chambers, but in a frozen village street fighting impossible odds to protect someone who'd taught him that caring about people wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made strength mean anything. "Stand down, Duke Vaymont." The voice came from behind the Crown soldiers, commanding and familiar. The troops parted, revealing Commander Aldrich Thorne, the man who'd betrayed House Vaymont 6 days ago, now leading the forces systematically destroying northern villages. Cedric remained positioned over Seraphine, his blade steady despite exhaustion threatening to collapse his legs. "Aldrich, come to finish what you started? I came to stop this before you get everyone killed. Surrender now. Accept trial. Your soldiers will be granted mercy if you submit. Mercy like the mercy you showed these villages? Those were Crown orders. I'm just following. If you finish that sentence, I'll kill you where you stand. You don't get to hide behind orders when you chose to execute them. You could have refused, could have resigned, could have chosen principle over preservation. But you didn't, so don't insult both of us by pretending you're just following orders." Thorne's expression flickered with something that might have been shame. "Your Grace, please. I've known you for 12 years. Don't make me kill you. You won't kill me, Aldrich. You'll watch while someone else does, then tell yourself you were just being professional. That's always been your greatest talent. Managing to be present for atrocities while avoiding personal responsibility." The commander's hand moved to his sword, fingers wrapping around the hilt. "Last chance, Cassian." "No." "Then you've chosen death." Thorne raised his hand, signaling the soldiers to advance. They moved forward, weapons ready, forming a circle that made escape impossible. Kadric prepared for final combat, his blade steady, his body positioned to protect Seraphine for as long as physically possible before overwhelming numbers crushed them both. This was the end. No miraculous rescue. No last-minute reinforcements. Just death in a frozen village street proving that principles mattered even when they cost everything. He was ready. Then the villagers attacked. Not soldiers, not trained fighters, just civilians, farmers and blacksmiths, and shopkeepers armed with tools and kitchen knives and improvised weapons, emerging from hiding to throw themselves at crown forces with the desperate courage of people who'd decided that dying on their feet was better than kneeling while their homes burned. Chaos erupted. Crown soldiers turned to face unexpected assault from behind, their formation fracturing, discipline collapsing under pressure from multiple directions. Kadric used the distraction, driving forward into the gap, his blade cutting through confused soldiers before they could recover. Sergeant Kael rallied the remaining troops, crashing into Crown forces with renewed violence. The battle turned savage. No formations, no strategy. Just desperate combat in narrow streets where superior numbers meant nothing when surrounded by people willing to die for their homes. Commander Thorn shouted orders that nobody could hear over the chaos, his voice lost in screaming and steel and the sound of a village refusing to surrender quietly. Kadric fought through the press, searching for Seraphine, finding her being helped to her feet by an older man with a blacksmith's build, her forehead still bleeding but her eyes focused again. "Can you move?" Kadric shouted over the noise. "I can fight, then stay close." They fought side by side through streets that had become abattoirs, stepping over bodies, pushing through smoke from burning buildings, killing anyone wearing crown colors until the enemy forces broke and ran, abandoning the village to save themselves. The battle ended with sunset. Crown forces retreated, leaving 30 dead behind. Kadric's troops had lost 14 more men. 9 soldiers remained alive. But the village survived. 400 civilians saved because farmers had chosen to fight instead of hide. Because people who'd never held weapons before decided that defending their duke was worth dying for. Kadric stood in the village square, surrounded by survivors, covered in blood and ash, feeling exhaustion pressed down so hard that standing felt like victory. An old man approached, the village elder, his face lined with age and recent trauma. "Your Grace, you saved us." "No, you saved yourselves. I just showed up. You showed up when no one else would, when the crown abandoned us, when every noble in the kingdom chose preservation over protection. You came. That matters more than strategy or tactics or anything else." The elder knelt, his movement stiff, his expression carrying weight that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with genuine gratitude. Around him, the entire village followed, kneeling in blood-stained snow before a duke who'd lost everything except the loyalty he'd earned by choosing people over power. Kadric felt something break in his chest. Not weakness, but the final collapse of walls he'd built around the parts of himself he'd kept buried for decades. These people weren't kneeling from fear. They were kneeling because he'd proven that rulers could be held accountable, that power meant responsibility, that caring about people wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made ruling worth anything. "Please," he said quietly, "don't kneel. Not to me. Stand. You earned the right to stand by defending your homes when defense seemed impossible." They stood, slowly, their faces showing the residual trauma of people who'd survived systematic slaughter. But underneath the trauma was something else. Hope, fragile and new. That maybe the world could be different if enough people chose differently. "What happens now, Your Grace?" the elder asked. "Now, you fortify this village. Organize defenses. Prepare for the crown to return with more forces. And if they do, you fight. Not for me. Not for House Vaymont. For yourselves. Because you've proven you're strong enough to refuse surrender. And you? I'm riding back to Raventhorn. Whatever's left of it, let us come with you, our fighters, our supplies. We can help defend the keep." "No. Defending Raventhorn is my responsibility. Defending this village is yours. But thank you for the offer." He remounted, signaling his remaining soldiers. Seraphine climbed onto her horse, her movement slow from injury, but her expression determined. They rode out of the village as night fell, leaving behind people who waved instead of cowering, who shouted gratitude instead of fear, who'd learned that rulers could choose service over self-preservation if they were brave enough to accept the cost. The ride back to Raventhorn took 6 hours through darkness. When they finally saw the keep rising against the night sky, torches burning on battlements, Cedric felt his heart constrict with something between hope and dread. The keep was still standing, still defended. Somehow, impossibly, it had survived. They rode through the eastern gate to find Captain Torvin waiting, his uniform blood-stained, his expression carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd fought overwhelming odds and somehow prevailed. "Your Grace," Torvin said, "the Crown forces arrived yesterday, laid siege. We held them off for 18 hours before they withdrew." Withdrew? Why would they withdraw? Because reinforcements arrived. "Sir," from the villages. Hundreds of civilians armed with farming tools in desperation. They hit the Crown forces from behind, broke the siege before it could succeed. Cedric stared at him, processing information that didn't match any strategic calculation he'd made. "The villages sent help?" "Every village you saved, sir. They sent their fighters. Said you'd proven you were worth defending by defending them first." Around the courtyard, soldiers stood watch beside civilians who'd never trained for combat but had chosen to fight anyway. Old men and young women, farmers and blacksmiths, shopkeepers and parents who'd decided that preserving Raventhorn was worth risking their lives. Cedric dismounted, his legs nearly giving out, his entire body screaming from exhaustion and accumulated injuries. Seraphine moved beside him, her hand finding his, steadying him when standing felt impossible. "You did it," she said quietly. "You actually did it. We did it. All of us. Together." He walked through the courtyard, acknowledging soldiers and civilians alike, seeing respect in their eyes that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with earned loyalty. For the first time in his adult life, Cedric understood what it felt like to rule with something other than fear. It felt like carrying weight that was actually worth bearing. The Crown's surrender came 3 days later. Not military surrender, they still had superior forces, but political capitulation. A message arrived under royal seal, acknowledging that destroying northern villages to crush rebellion had created refugee crisis the capital couldn't manage. The killing civilians had turned public opinion against the Crown. The continuing the siege would cost more in resources and reputation than simply negotiating terms. The letter offered compromise. Duke Vaemont would maintain autonomous rule over northern territories in exchange for nominal Crown oversight and resumption of tribute payments. Charges of treason would be dismissed. Commander Thorne and other conspirators would face trial for unauthorized violence against civilians. It wasn't victory, it was survival with conditions. But survival with conditions was more than Cedric had expected when he declared independence, more than he'd hoped for when riding toward burning villages, more than seemed possible when standing surrounded by enemies knowing death was inevitable. He accepted the terms, not because they were ideal, but because continuing to fight meant more civilian deaths for the sake of pride, and pride wasn't worth the cost anymore. The formal negotiations happened at Raventhorn over 2 weeks of careful diplomacy. Crown representatives arrived with legal documents. Cedric signed them with Seraphine beside him, her hand bandaged from wounds sustained in combat, her presence a reminder that he'd survived because people had chosen to stand with him instead of against him. When the diplomats finally left, when the terms were finalized and autonomous rule was guaranteed, Cedric stood on the battlements watching them disappear into winter landscape that had transformed from war zone to negotiated peace. Beside him, Seraphine leaned against stone walls worn smooth by centuries of weather. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Exhausting. That's not an emotion. It's the only one I have left." Everything else burned out somewhere between the 4th village and watching farmers attack trained soldiers to save my life. "You changed the kingdom. I survived the kingdom. There's a difference." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "No. You actually changed it. The Crown can't ignore civilian deaths anymore. Nobles can't massacre villages without political consequences. Rulers are being held accountable in ways they never were before. That's not survival. That's transformation." Cedric considered this, watching smoke rise from Raventhorn's chimneys, normal smoke from cooking fires instead of burning villages, life resuming its patterns after chaos had passed through and left survivors in its wake. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had changed something fundamental about how power operated in Valadorn, but the cost had been devastating. Thousands dead, villages destroyed, his own forces reduced from professional army to exhausted survivors, relationships shattered by betrayals that would take generations to rebuild. Victory felt like surviving long enough to count the bodies. "I'm tired, Seraphine," he said quietly. "Tired of fighting. Tired of making impossible decisions. Tired of waking up calculating who needs to die today to keep everyone else alive." "Then stop." "I can't. This is who I am." "No. This is who you were. Who you are now is someone who rode into burning villages to save strangers. Someone who chose principle over preservation. Someone who learned that caring about people makes you stronger, not weaker." She moved closer, her hand finding his, her touch gentle against scars and calluses accumulated through years of violence. "You spent your entire life believing that fear was the only language power understood," she continued. "But you were wrong. What power actually understands is worth. And you finally proved you're worth following, worth defending, worth standing beside, even when standing beside you means risking everything." Kadric pulled her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, steady and real and alive in ways that made everything else feel temporary. "I wouldn't have survived without you," he admitted. "I know. That's not modesty talking. I'm stating fact. You challenged every assumption I made about strength and weakness. You forced me to confront that isolation wasn't protection. It was just cowardice wearing strategic clothing. You saved my life by teaching me how to actually live instead of just surviving. So what happens now? Now we rebuild. Not of the empire I lost, something different, something better. A territory governed by actual accountability instead of fear, where rulers serve people instead of using them, where power comes with responsibility instead of privilege. That's going to take decades. Then we have decades. Together." She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen since the massacres began. Together. They stood on the battlements watching dawn break over territories that had survived systematic destruction, over villages rebuilding from ashes, over people who'd learned that resistance was possible when enough individuals chose courage over comfort. And Kadric felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the fragile kind that shattered under pressure, but the durable kind that survived because it was built on foundation of actual worth instead of accumulated fear. He'd lost almost everything. His reputation as the untouchable duke who ruled through terror. His belief that isolation protected him from vulnerability. His certainty that caring about people made him weak. But he'd gained something more valuable than any of those losses. He'd gained the knowledge that strength wasn't about how much power you accumulated. It was about how you used that power when using it cost you everything. And he'd learned that lesson in the most devastating way possible, surrounded by burning villages and dying soldiers and civilians who'd chosen to defend him because he'd finally proven he was worth defending. That knowledge would define the rest of his life, would shape every decision he made going forward, would determine whether the northern territories became something different, something better than the fear-based empire he'd spent years building. The future was uncertain. Survival was still fragile, but for the first time in his adult life, Kadric believed that building something worth preserving was actually possible. Not through fear, through worth. And that belief was enough. 6 months later, Raventhorn Keep hosted the first territorial council. Not a gathering of nobles dispensing commands, but an actual council where village representatives had equal voice with military commanders, where civilians could challenge decisions and demand accountability, where power came with responsibility instead of privilege. Kadric sat at the head of the table not as a duke who ruled through fear, but as a leader who'd earned authority by proving he was willing to sacrifice everything to protect people instead of preserving power. Beside him, Seraphine served as his advisor, her insights challenging assumptions he still made, her presence a constant reminder that partnership meant accepting perspectives different from his own. Around the table, representatives debated policies, tax structures that protected villages instead of extracting wealth, military organization that prioritized defense over expansion, judicial reforms that held nobles accountable for crimes against civilians. It was messy, inefficient, frustrating in ways that autocratic rule never was, but it was honest. And honesty mattered more than efficiency when efficiency came at the cost of justice. The meeting ended after 4 hours of debate, representatives departing with agreements that felt fragile but genuine. Kadric remained at the table, exhausted from negotiation, feeling the weight of compromise that came from actually listening instead of commanding. Seraphine touched his shoulder. "You did well. I let them argue for 90 minutes about grain distribution. That's not governing. That's chaos. That's democracy. Messy, inefficient, frustrating democracy, where people who will be affected by decisions get to participate in making them. I preferred fear. It was faster. And it got thousands of people killed. So maybe slower is better. She was right, and Kaedric felt the truth of it settle into his bones. He'd spent years believing that decisive autocratic rule was superior to collaborative governance, because collaboration took time and time cost lives. But autocratic rule had also cost lives. Just different lives, quieter deaths, civilians who suffered because one man made decisions without consulting the people those decisions affected. This new approach was harder, slower, more vulnerable to mistakes because mistakes came from consensus instead of individual calculation. But it was also more honest, more accountable, more aligned with the principles he'd almost died defending, and those principles mattered more than efficiency. That night, Kaedric stood at the window of his chambers overlooking the northern sea. Waves crashed against black cliffs with the rhythm of warfare that had witnessed 8 generations of Vaymont rule and would witness countless more. Behind him, Seraphine moved through the room preparing for sleep, her presence transforming space that had felt like a prison into something closer to home. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up absolute power for this collaborative mess?" "Every day. But you'd make the same choice again. Every time. Because power without accountability is just violence waiting to be replaced by better violence. And you finally understand that. I understand that I spent 30 years accumulating power through fear, and it got me nothing except isolation and enemies. And I spent 6 months building something different, something based on worth instead of terror. And it got me a territory that might actually survive beyond my lifetime. So which approach was right? Neither. Both. They were right for different versions of me. The person I was needed feared to survive in a world designed to destroy anyone vulnerable enough to show mercy. The person I'm becoming needs worth to build something that lasts beyond fear. And which person do you want to be? Kaedric turned from the window. The person who learns from his mistakes instead of repeating them. The person who admits that caring about people makes him stronger, not weaker. The person who accepts that ruling with accountability is harder than ruling with fear, but harder doesn't mean wrong. Seraphine crossed to him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her head resting against his chest. "I'm proud of you." "Don't be. Pride requires success. All I've done is survive long enough to realize I was wrong about everything. Admitting you were wrong about everything is the hardest form of success. Most people spend their entire lives defending mistakes instead of learning from them." She was right again, cutting through defensive cynicism to expose the truth underneath. He had changed, fundamentally, in ways that couldn't be reversed even if he wanted to return to the ruthless Duke who ruled through fear. That person was gone, burned away in village streets and desperate battles, and the recognition that power meant nothing if you couldn't use it to protect something worth protecting. What remained was someone different, someone scarred and exhausted, and fundamentally altered by the realization that strength came from vulnerability, that leadership required service, that caring about people was the only thing that made accumulating power worthwhile. And that person, the one who'd learned those lessons through fire and blood and nearly losing everything, was someone he could finally respect, not because he was powerful, but because he'd learned to use power for something beyond his own survival. Outside, dawn began breaking over the northern territories. Inside Raventhorn Keep, people slept in beds instead of barracks. Civilians mixed with soldiers. Former enemies worked alongside former allies, all of them rebuilding something that had been destroyed and choosing to build it differently this time. Better, more just, more aligned with principles that valued people over privilege. It wouldn't be perfect, would never be perfect, but it would be honest. And honesty was enough. Kaedric pulled Seraphine closer, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, feeling the weight of everything they'd survived together, feeling the future stretching ahead uncertain and difficult and worth fighting for. Not because survival was guaranteed, but because the attempt to build something better mattered more than the certainty of success. And that understanding, that simple, but really devastating recognition that trying mattered more than winning, was the most important lesson he'd ever learned. The ruthless Duke who ruled through fear was dead. What remained was just a man who'd learned to care about people. And that man was finally strong enough to admit that caring was the only strength worth having. Sats. 3 years later, the Northern Territories had transformed into something unprecedented in Valadorn's history. Villages governed themselves through elected councils. Military forces served defensive purposes instead of conquest. Trade flourished without extraction. Nobles held positions through competence instead of birthright. The kingdom watched with mixture of fascination and horror as Caedric Vaemont proved that alternative governance was possible, that rulers could be held accountable, that power could serve people instead of consuming them. Other territories began experimenting with similar reforms. The crown resisted but couldn't stop the spread of ideas that had survived systematic attempts at destruction. Change was slow, painful, incomplete, but it was happening. And Caedric watched it happen from Raventhorn's battlements, standing beside the woman who taught him that transformation was possible if you were brave enough to admit you'd been wrong about everything. Seraphine, now his wife in ceremony that had meant something beyond strategic alliance, stood with their infant daughter wrapped in blankets against winter cold. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking that 3 years ago I would have considered this weakness. A duke standing with his family instead of commanding from isolation, caring about people more than power, building consensus instead of ruling through fear. And now I understand that I was wrong about what strength means. Real strength isn't maintaining control. It's accepting that control was always an illusion and building something worth protecting instead." Their daughter made soft noises, unaware that she was being held by a man who'd almost destroyed everything before learning how to actually build something worth preserving. "What will you tell her?" Seraphine asked. "When she's old enough to understand? What lesson from all of this?" Caedric looked out across territories that had survived systematic destruction and chosen to rebuild differently, across villages where people governed themselves, across a landscape transformed by the recognition that change was possible when enough people chose courage over comfort. "I'll tell her that power without accountability is just violence waiting to be replaced. That caring about people makes you stronger, not weaker. That the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with the courage to admit you were wrong and the determination to do better. And if she asks whether you regret any of it, I'll tell her I regret every death, every village burned, every mistake I made by prioritizing power over people. But I don't regret learning from those mistakes. And I don't regret choosing to build something better, even when building it cost everything." Seraphine smiled, the expression carrying weight of someone who'd witnessed transformation most people considered impossible. "You've changed the kingdom. We've changed it, together." "Together," she agreed. And standing there on the battlements of Raventhorn Keep, holding his daughter, watching dawn break over territories that had learned to govern themselves, Caedric Vaemont finally understood what it meant to rule with something other than fear. It meant accepting that you would fail, that people would die despite your best efforts, that perfection was impossible, and striving for it anyway was the only thing that made leadership worthwhile. But most importantly, it meant recognizing that strength came from admitting weakness, that power served people instead of consuming them, and that caring about something beyond your own survival was the only thing that made any of this matter. The ruthless duke was dead. What remained was just a father holding his daughter, watching sunrise, hoping that the world she inherited would be better than the one he'd almost destroyed. And that hope, fragile and hard-won and built on foundation of devastating mistakes, was finally enough.